Charles, welcome. And we have a special guest with us today, Doug. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's lovely to meet you.
Great
Charles,
to see you again,
lovely
Jason.
to spend another Sunday with you. Why don't we first of all explain who our guest is and wish him a warm welcome.
Well, yeah, we're honored to have Doug White with us, who is one of the world's experts on philanthropy. You've spent more than 30 years of your life, now almost 40 years of your life, looking at charities.
I hate to acknowledge that, but you are absolutely correct.
You started when you were 5.
Yes.
But we're going to go into Doug's background in some considerable depth today and get his views on not only the Wounded Warrior Project, which is an area that Doug knows extremely well, but we're going to explore how the authorities and the media has jumped on the Wounded Warrior Project, been basically silent, the mainstream media, about the Clinton Foundation, and in exploring the contrast between the records of each of the two organizations and the media reactions to both. I think we're going to learn a lot about the bias in the media, and that'll be a nice big topic to go into. So
Look forward to that. And look forward to going into that with you.
Well, thanks so much, Doug, and thanks also to each week the art department outdoes itself, and once again the art department on short notice here has come up with this great poster, and Jason is, I don't know if I'm allowed to reveal the issue of your site.
Colorblindness?
Yeah.
I've discussed it in the past.
Right. So
Yeah.
Jason, believe it or not, is colorblind. But nonetheless, he supervises the art department, which is himself. And I pointed out to him that this is actually fantastic, because here you have slightly different skin tone for the body than from Hillary's head. But of course, we all know a fish rots from the head. And so and what we try to do, and Jason is really extremely good about this, is we try to pick movies and posters that people already know about, and then we riff on them to kind of give somebody a chuckle to begin the show. So this, I think, sets up the discussion. Maybe we can go to the first slide, Jason, if that's okay.
I think I might have screwed something up for our most beloved Patreon subscribers. I hope not. Let me just check that real quick. You know, Charles, I recently, after these malicious strikes that we've had, have added a bunch of different services, and yes, see, it's so complicated now. I screwed it up. I hope we can make this work for our Patreon subscribers. People who go to patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth are actually supporting the show in an ongoing way. So what I did was I added Vimeo, which is an alternative service that is designed to allow our Patreon subscribers to enjoy the show without being disturbed by the malicious interference of some of our detractors. And I do believe Patreon is now live. So I want to thank the Patreon sponsors. Actually, just the other day, we received the largest single monthly subscription from an individual who is sponsoring the show for $100 per month. So there we go. We're live on Patreon right now, and that's a very generous sponsorship. I definitely don't want anyone to sponsor the show for any amount of money that puts them out financially, but I'm glad we got that straightened out. So without further ado, Charles, should we get right into your slides?
Yeah. So what we try to do is to, now this is I think our 68th or 69th show, and we try to put a lot of preparation into each show and have thoughtful guests. And again, we really appreciate your being here. The idea here is to really contrast not simply Wounded Warrior Project with the Clinton Foundation, but also revisit this whole issue of what may have been happening in the period 2015, 2016, in the primaries and the presidential election, what the Obama administration may have been doing, and then not just to focus on the recent history, but to go deeper into history and to ask ourselves whether the administration of government has been corrupted by people in both parties who give us a false dance, and a false set of choices, when in reality Democrats and Republicans may both have been involved for longer than 8 years, maybe for longer than 16 years or 18 years, maybe going back, I would argue to 1988 or even 1981, that these establishment players have sort of corrupted the system to the detriment of people across the political spectrum who are not in the elite. And so we think that when we look at the corrupt administration of charities, the corrupt targeting of Wounded Warrior Project, or the corrupt letting the Clinton Foundation escalate its frauds without being targeted, these are, they're problems, but they're symptoms of an underlying illness. And so that's what we try to address in these shows. And we're delighted to bring in this Wounded Warrior angle, because I think it's a real pity what has happened to that charity.
It is, and as you know, the latest tax returns, we call them tax returns informally. They're not tax returns, but they are filed with the IRS, so we call them that. They're called information returns, and every year a charity has to supply the information to the IRS and to the state's attorneys general. And the most recent one is for their fiscal year 2017, which ended last September 30th. So it ended September 30, 2017. They had until now, and they just sent them out, I guess, on Thursday this past week, or maybe Wednesday, I forget. And it shows what was going on up until that moment, and it's not a pretty picture. So they had a lot of things that we'll talk about, but they had a lot of things that they have had to overcome and deal with since the original news broadcasts and newspaper stories in late January 2016.
Good. So what we'll do is, Jason, if we can go to the next page, regular viewers have seen this disclaimer before, and it's an important thing we like to go over it each time, particularly for the new viewers. We are exercising our First Amendment rights, but we're not just spouting off. We do grounded research. We provide links in all of our broadcasts to the underlying source material that is the basis of our analysis. And we definitely appreciate constructive criticism, both on air and on set, and from viewers who may watch this afterwards. But this is a fact-based analysis, and we don't go so far. You mentioned the 990s for Wounded Warrior Project. We can't check that the primary information that went into the 990 is correct.
This is true.
But there's a difference here. The 990 is signed under penalties of perjury and is generally transmitted across state lines into an IRS department. So if somebody has sworn under penalties of perjury and sent these materials not only to the IRS but to the many states, then they're in considerable legal jeopardy if the authorities ever want to do something about it. So with regard to the 990s, we don't feel badly about the fact that we haven't gone and made sure that the revenues they put in there are their actual revenues of the charity. We think you can learn a lot from these public filings.
And I think you're right to assume that should be primary information. What you're saying, I think, is that you didn't go deeper into the numbers that are on the 990, like go to their actual books and do an accounting or forensic accounting. I don't think that should be a requirement for anybody investigating the finances of an organization. Now, that said, the 990 doesn't go all that deep.
Right.
And it's not that specific, so there's that. But what is on the 990, we should assume is true because of what you just said. Now, within that, however, the 990 does have some gray area. It does have some interpretation areas that organizations have used differently. And one of them, by the way, is an area that the Wounded Warrior Project got caught up in. They were doing it correctly, but there was some question about it. So I think you're right. That's a good start. And we'll talk about the rating services later on, but in terms of evaluating a charity, 990 is a solid start. It's by no means the largest or most primary source of information you should have, but it's a good start. I would say if you're looking at a charity and you want to evaluate it from a total perspective, the way I would, not the way the charity rating services do, the 990 might provide the first 5% of the process.
Right.
But that first 5% of the process is important, and as you were saying, I think it's fair to assume that information is correct, given some of the interpretations that some of the charities do.
Great. So what we have here, we have on my site, I haven't really updated my site in quite a while on the advice of certain people who going to be working on a book, so why give it all away on your site for free? But we do have a playlist, and I don't know, Jason, if we can hit that playlist thing. Yeah, there we go. So Jason has put together this playlist on YouTube, which shows, I think there are, what, 68, 69, 68 so far, so this is the 69th that we're doing now. And in each case, we have slides, just like we're going to go through now, and they're all for free available on this playlist. So to the prosecutors, to the investigators, to the people who are trying to wrap their minds around the extent of the potential frauds that we see in the Clinton Foundation, here is a rich resource. I think this has got to be, at this point, approaching 140 hours of information and probably many hundreds of pages of slides. We tried to take a different perspective each time on that. You look at it this way, look at it that way, because this is so complicated. It's not simply the Presidential Library and Research Center in Little Rock. There's all sorts of problems around the world. There are all sorts of allied businesses that should not be operating in concert with the Clinton Foundation. There's a substantial private gain created through the operation of these false front charities. And so we picked it apart bit by bit by bit by bit. Next week we're going to begin the process of creating a roadmap for somebody who doesn't want to say, well, to understand this I've got to watch 140 hours. We'll give you a table of contents and a map and say, if you're interested in this topic, go here. This topic, go there, and try to put it all together.
I think that's really important. I don't know what you know about the Clinton Foundation. I know a little bit about it from an organizational perspective, maybe a bit of perspective on board governance and so forth. But I think there are serious questions that anyone, even someone who feels that she is a good person politically, from the perspective of the organization, there are legitimate questions. You seem to have done a lot of homework on that, much more than I have, that's for sure. And so I'm looking forward to learning some stuff from you as well.
Great. Well, let's go into the next page. And what we try to do, Doug, each week, Jason is well familiar with this, we try to review what we think is important that happened in the preceding week, and then we close the presentation talking about what we think could be important for the coming week. And one of the things that came out here late last week, the first link is about Hillary Clinton. And this is a writer I think it's by Monica Showalter in the American Thinker. I may have that wrong. It takes a little time to get the links up. It's all right. But the basic, yeah, there it is.
Part of the issue I've been dealing with, Charles, is that, this has been time phone hack week. And I just have been out of time. Yeah,
You're being
really
hacked.
Trying to get that back together.
So when we go back, Monica Showalter is a very good writer. She's been around for a while. When I had my radio show in the Washington Times, I interviewed her once. I like her work. I also like Thomas Lifson, the American Thinker.
I'm familiar with the organization. I mean,
I've written a few pieces for him, and he's a very smart man, despite having gone to Harvard undergraduate. Just teasing him a little bit. But anyway, the point here is, and if you remember towards the end of the 2016 campaign, Hillary was pounding the table that Donald Trump better concede, there's been one election, you're going to lose, you're going to go away and just be done with it. And here we are, it's a year and a half, I suppose, more or less a year and a half since the 2016 election, and week after week there's another excuse, there's another reason. And and our audience knows that I'm not actually a political person. I comment about it.
You mentioned that, yes.
I'm not interested in politics, and I'm not saying that to be coy, to be dragged into. I had no interest. I got many other things I like to do. But a bit of advice, and I know Democrats love to give Republicans advice, and Democrats probably won't listen to me. I come out of a Republican background, but the longer this person takes up space in the print, on the radio, on television, the better it is for Donald Trump and challengers. And it just, at this stage, to be coming up with yet another excuse. We introed with Shaggy's great funny piece, "It Wasn't Me." That's really the motto for Hillary Clinton. Nothing about her loss is her fault. The fact that she didn't bother to campaign, she didn't have a message, she had this conflicted foundation she didn't want to explain, the Secret Service, none of that is her fault, you know. And you know, I just would encourage the powers that be that remain in the Democratic Party, if you want to win, if you want to be competitive, let the Clintons beat a hasty retreat quickly. So if we go to the next link, we have the revelation here, as Jason's pulling it up, that, and I don't know, Doug, if you watch Zero Hedge closely, but Zero Hedge, I think is one of the best internet sites that out there for business and politics, and also just generally funny things that happen.
Okay, well, it sounds interesting. I haven't familiarized myself with it, but it looks interesting.
So what's good about this one, and what the news sites I like, are ones that give you quick analysis so you can figure out if you want to learn more, and then point to the source materials.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what Zero Hedge does so effectively. When something happens, they give you the primary source, they give you their take on it, and the comment section are very, very funny, and it's free. So this has, I think, become one of the leading sites, and here they're reporting that the Democratic Party has sued Donald Trump and Russia and WikiLeaks and other people over the 2016 loss. So you met, we won't mention his name, but you met the very experienced lawyer, who's my close friend. He quickly looked at the lawsuit. It's a strike suit lawsuit, contingency fee thing. It's just a money-raising exercise. It doesn't have a prayer of winning.
Well, what do you think about the irony of the DNC suing Russia when Jared and Elizabeth Beck initiated a class action lawsuit against them, and they basically said, F you, we can do whatever we want. In open court, they said that. We don't need to stick to what people vote for. We can just choose whoever we want in the primaries.
You're talking about the superdelegate issue that...
I'm talking about how the Becks initiated a lawsuit against the DNC, and they literally said in open court that whoever people vote for in the primaries does not need to be the candidate that they choose. Essentially admitting that raising all this money for Bernie Sanders or whoever has no bearing whatsoever on who they choose as the candidate. And then they use all that money they raised to turn around and sue Russia and Trump for winning.
So, I mean, it's not impressive.
Not good.
So if we go to the next slide.
Yeah.
Then there's this whole issue, and we don't need to bring these two links up. People can read these for themselves. But the one very curious oddity of the lawsuit that I noticed, and our experienced people noticed, is the lawsuit does not appear to rely on the Steele dossier at all.
Your notes said something along those lines. I saw that this morning before I got here.
Yeah. So it's
a really humorous lawsuit. There's a lot of these lawsuits flying around, Charles. It seems like people on this side of the argument feel like they can just initiate lawsuits about anything. I don't like that pocket square, I'm going to sue you.
That's right. Now I'm going to be sued over it, right? Thanks, Jason.
I didn't mean to give anybody, standing.
That's all right. So, again, we don't have to bring this one up, the Fox Insider, although the Fox Insider is a great website. I happen to know the people who are involved with it, and they do deep investigative work, actually, again, with their sources. But, why has nobody in the mainstream media asked a simple question? If the Democrats were so concerned about the hacking, how come the FBI didn't look at the DNC server? And how come the DNC refused to turn it over? I mean, it boggles the mind.
What about, Charles, this whole revolving door deal where ex-FBI people go and form the company CrowdStrike, and then they're the only ones to investigate, and then James Comey publicly describes them as a trusted third party, and their, Chief Technology Officer Dmitry Alperovitch is also a part of the Atlantic Council, which seems to be one of these think tanks that's dedicated to destroying Trump and doing a bunch of other things that are anti-Russia and trumping up, pardon the pun there, all these, anti-Russia hysteria. I mean, there's a lot of weird stuff going on, and you've expressed your distaste for this sort of activity where these spooks, for lack of a better descriptor, start their own private spooking companies and then go get hired by the FBI or the CIA so that they can act in ways that these agencies are specifically prevented from acting, so that they can do things to harm private citizens of the U.S. that we're specifically protected from the FBI and the CIA doing, not necessarily protected from these private firms.
Yeah, I don't like it at all. I mean, it goes, one of our themes that we talk about is that the regulatory apparatus in 2018 is not up to the technology of 2018. It's almost as if it is purposefully gamed. In the SEC, regulating charities, the IRS, et cetera. It puts way too much power into the hands of people who claim they're nonpartisan, but can very easily, like James Comey, I think is a good example, or McCabe, and on the Republican side as well, they can easily be gamed if they have they themselves are nonpartisan, but maybe their wife or their partner or their father or their whatever are political animals. And this needs to be addressed, and the idea that we could have private security services that, breaking the law, fighting wars for us, et cetera. I don't think we should be doing that. If we're going to fight wars externally, I think our Army, Navy, military, they should be doing that. It should be under the control of, in theory, responsible people. And domestically, I really don't like the idea of private security services intermingling and
G4S and stuff like this.
I don't like that at all. I understand the arguments, but I don't like it because you're sitting there, you're a loyal person in the FBI or whatever, and let's say you're making whatever you make, 150 if you're very top of the food chain. And
SES?
you see your friend over here leave the FBI to get a job making a $500,000 salary and stock options and bonuses and this and that. The temptation to have confidential information about political opponents or competitors lifted from FBI files, taken out of the building, given to your buddy over here to make sure that you do get that $500,000 job is just too great. It really is too great. And we see in the history, I know more about the Clintons than others, but we saw in the Clinton presidency them lifting FBI files, which contain not just, the FBI files are highly sensitive apparently because they include blind alleys, they include things that may have been debunked, they could be for cases that people made a decision not to go forward with them. That kind of information must not go outside of the government, in my view. But we know under the Clinton period that somehow, they don't know why, a bunch of FBI files on Republicans and other people ended up in the possession of the Clinton team. Political team. That's wrong. And if they did it back then, they could do it again. And they did it back then and got away with it. That gives the Bush team and other people, the Obamas, et cetera, Trump team for that matter, the excuse to say, well, no one's going to catch us. And so I don't like that at all, which is why I say here, there has got to be a top to bottom house cleaning across the places in government where government officials may have been weaponized to go against their political opponents. I remember, we're about the same age, and I remember I had a great summer job in 1974 working, of all things, as a proofreader at Simpson Thacher.
Did you really?
Yeah. I was 18. And that was all during the Watergate stuff. And,
wow.
And it was really, really interesting because I was so much younger than anybody else there, and they're like, what the hell are you doing here, kid? You should be playing tennis. But I wanted to make some money.
Yeah.
So I did.
You should be calling foot faults on George Soros.
Which I have done, actually.
That's why I bring it up all the time.
It hasn't changed his trajectory at all, or whatever it is, trajectory. But so I had the good fortune of watching Watergate unfold, at a time when the newspapers were full of news and all these lawyers cared a lot about it. And, if you go back to then, I think it was Chuck Colson got in trouble for the FBI files or tax files or whatever.
Yeah, he did. That's an interesting part of our history. And of course, I know this is the topic of the day right now so far. Hillary Clinton was very involved with the investigation as well back then. That was one of her first government positions.
Until she was kicked off that team.
Well,
wasn't she doing
going
something?
down one way.
Wasn't she doing something with forging documents?
What she was doing, and this is from I'm a little familiar with this. So
please.
the person who was supervising the team was a Democrat, and there was a source book, like a source volume or something, that contained an important precedent that the people needed to get. So Hillary's bright idea was to take this book and take it out of the ability of anyone to see it. And the guy running the team found out about it. He said, "You can't do that. It's completely unethical behavior," and booted her off the team. She was a young person. She might even have been just a law student, or maybe shortly
Right
after.
afterwards, I believe, yeah.
So her propensity to commit crimes was ingrained early.
Well, again, and you'll see we focus on the Bush side as well. We're not, now I'm whooping up on the warrior princess for a good reason, but,
Yes.
so, let's see, I want to just flag this conservative treehouse. I mean, you probably haven't seen this one either. This is a website that, and in particular, this person who posts Sundance posts these incredibly intricate articles with links, etc., so you can check them. A very, very smart analysis, going back over the ground of just exactly how did this whole idea of investigating Trump start out. You know, some say the night, the early morning when he won, is when Brennan, went into high gear. Others say that actually Brennan's role began in March of 2016. But this is a very interesting read for people to think about after our show. Go read it for yourselves. It's a very in-depth analysis of maybe how this thing was kicked into high gear to gin up the special prosecutor. So go back in. Now, I brought this up here, Jason, for your benefit. We talked about this at our last Sunday show. We talked about the chemical strike.
Right.
And Jason and I think many of our viewers, perhaps you, are all deeply skeptical of these incidents that are then quickly used to galvanize the use of military force or jumping to a conclusion about what may have happened. Because often these big incidents are extremely complicated. And I have personally been watching in Syria last year. I was one of the people who said, now wait a minute. When they had the pictures last year of people, rescue workers coming in supposedly to rescue people who had been harmed by, I think it was in that case sarin gas. These rescue people had no protective gear. And I'm told, I'm not a medical person, but I'm told that if you're going to try to take care of somebody who's been hit by sarin gas, you don't just like take your hand and start washing off the sarin gas on somebody else. You better be protected because you could get hit. And the scene didn't make sense. In this case, the idea that Assad would, after Trump said, we're going to get out of Syria, that Assad would go and perpetrate this kind of an act, didn't seem to be in his interest. It didn't seem to be in Russia's interest. It struck me that however many years we now have been at war after 2001, 17 years almost in the Middle East, forgetting the period beforehand, it strikes me that before we rush into yet another theater in the Middle East, we ought to actually have a real debate in the United States of America about
an investigation at least.
Well, really, what is our national interest across the Middle East? Why are we? How much money have we already spent? Our debt is $21 trillion at federal level that we know about. Are we really in a place where we want to provoke, expand the war in the Middle East? And let's have a real debate about that, where progressives can talk, conservatives can talk, apolitical people can talk. Let's go back over the 17 years and say, hey, did we get? Was all the money that we spent, was it worth it?
Yeah.
And if we think it wasn't worth it, and we think it is important to spend more money in this area, what should be the milestones? What should be the objectives? This is a kind of debate that I think actually would galvanize common interests across the spectrum, from progressives who are against war to conservatives, fiscally minded conservatives who say, maybe it's a good war, but what's our national interest and how do we help on this?
Yeah. And David Hawkins and I have been really diving into some more of the facts and details surrounding the source of some of these chemicals. David's got a really unique process of looking at patents and different patents related to things like these gases. Like there was that Novichok attack in Salisbury on the British or
Skripal.
Russian, right, the double agent guy. And right away, the British government came out and said, well, this is from Russia. But David points out patents at various companies and organizations in the United States, including Northwestern University in Chicago, where Bernardine Dawn is regularly giving lectures on torture practices and principles. So there's some bizarre things going on there.
Yeah, exactly. So now we're getting closer back to your bailiwick here, Doug. We're going to talk about this guy here in Kansas, Greitens.
He's not in Kansas anymore, Charles.
Yeah. This is the governor, right?
Yes.
And this is another veteran charity, and apparently there may have been some bad this governor initially looked interesting to me because he was, not really from a political background. His campaign was very controversial. But he has been accused of first intimidating somebody with whom he was having an affair, and now this allegation. And here we have, I think it's Attorney General Hawley is it Kansas, I believe? Yeah, Kansas. Is it Kansas or Missouri? Missouri, I guess. Missouri. Sorry about that. They are jumping down Greitens' throat over a relatively small, in terms of money, potential offense with the charity. Gives you a sense. We now have Corinne Brown rotting in prison for 5 years, former congressman, $800,000 for charity fraud in Florida. We have Steve Stockman in Texas, a former conservative Republican, or a conservative Republican and former congressman who is probably going to go to jail, convicted 23 felonies for $1.3 million. And I don't know how many millions this is, but I think it's certainly not anywhere close to the scale of the Clinton Foundation. And this shows that when the apparatus wants to get serious about charity fraud, which is a heinous crime, and it's not a victimless crime, the way in which the Clintons have carried it out, but when people want to get serious about it, they do. And
whenever there's charity fraud, it's not a victimless crime, and it is very serious no matter what. Even if there are $0 involved, it's still expensive because public dollars are being used to fund the charity. So any kind of fraud has to be investigated. You sent me this link 2 days ago after we spoke, and I'm really glad you did. It came out that day. And from what I read, what he did was he stole basically and used a veterans list of donors for his own purposes. And that, to me, is bad. Obviously, the law fails his way. But why that's bad to me is that we're mixing politics and what should be the nonprofit sector, which I know is your whole thesis with regard to the Clintons, but it's not just the Clintons. This is a problem everywhere. The potential is there everywhere, and charities need to be very careful about how they behave. But then on top of that, this was not the veterans charity's fault. It was Greitens himself. We have to be very vigilant about that. A lot of people do things and they kind of clothe themselves in the charitable ethos when they're really doing something very bad. We have to be very careful and stay on top of that.
Right.
Now, Doug, real quickly, when you say public funds are used to fund charities, is that because they're tax exempt? So how are public funds used?
Well, there are a couple of ways. Public charity. Is it all right if we go into this at this point?
Of course,
I don't
of
know
course.
If you had any other
of
stuff
course.
on the Clinton Foundation in particular. We'll get back to that, of course. But in general, the idea of public charity is that it's tax exempt.
Right.
So that if you have an investment account of $1 million, you pay taxes on any capital gains that are realized. Charities don't have to do that in their investment accounts. They can just trade, buy, sell, whatever, and not pay any taxes if there are any gains. So they're tax exempt in that sense. But more important to the average donor is that every time they make a gift, it's eligible for a tax deduction. So if I give you $1, if you're a charity and I give you $1, and I'm in the 30% tax bracket, ultimately it's only going to cost me 70 cents to give you that $1, because I can write that $1 off of my taxes.
So it's 30 cents coming out of the pocket of the public.
Bingo. And this is something that very few people really understand. In that sense, that's one reason we call them a public charity, but in that sense, the public does support charities. Now, the way the system works, and this can get somewhat controversial when you think about it, you are supporting, as a taxpayer, not as a donor necessarily, but you're supporting organizations that you may not agree with. And that could be a church. or a mosque or a synagogue, you may not feel like you want to support those organizations. And you don't because you're, let's say, not donating to them. But if you're a taxpayer, you are in effect donating to all charities. That's just the way the deduction system works. So that's what I mean by public dollars supporting charities.
Well, that's really amazing insight, and that makes the concept of charity fraud really much more important for us all to be aware of.
But as we like to joke around, but wait, there's more.
Well,
and one I'd just like to put out there so people can be thinking about it as we begin to get into a little bit talking about your background. The one thing that happened positively under Bill Clinton's tenure, I'll give you a left-handed compliment there, Billy, is that he changed the way in which donations of appreciated property are treated under the tax law. So it used to be that you could donate just the cost of something. He changed it. You could donate the fair market value, or under his tenure. So you could take stock, Microsoft stock as an example, where Bill Gates, let's say, spent not even a penny a share, and you could donate $1 billion worth of Microsoft stock, and you could then get that 30 cents you're talking about back. And if you give the shares of Microsoft to the foundation that you control, which is the case of what he did do, you're actually not giving anything away. You still control the stock through your foundation, but you get this gigantic $300 million refund back from the government. So it's not just a little tiny trick here for small people, small income people. The big income people who give appreciated stock, as many people have done, are actually not necessarily as pure in their motives as you might think. It's a very clever tax management approach to get cash in your pocket back, assuming you have other income, cash in your pocket back from the federal and state governments if you're paying state taxes and local taxes, and still maintain control of these appreciated securities. So there's some high-level fraud that can be operating here, and we see it in the Clinton Foundation in multiple cases.
Well, what you just described, I wouldn't say is fraud so much. It's maybe a misuse of what is legal, because what Gates did, when you say he continues to control that, when he was, let's say, involved with when he was on the board, yes, you're right, he has the ability to be influential in how that money is being used. But let's go back a second to the Clinton era. During that time, there was the tax law. Let's go back to something more basic. Remember a moment ago I was saying that when you give $1 in your 30% tax bracket, it's really only costing you 70 cents. It's still costing you 70 cents though. That's the other thing. It's not like you're getting any money back. When you give appreciated property, as you just were describing, let's say that I have $1 worth of stock that's valued at $1 today, but I only paid 10 cents for it, a decade ago. So that 10 cents is my cost basis, is what we call it, and the $1 is now called the fair market value. And you could give away that $1 and get a deduction for the entire $1, not the 10 cents. Now, what happened during just a little bit of a clarification on this, what happened during the Clinton administration, the tax law was changed so that the appreciated portion of that gift would be subject to the alternative minimum tax. And so there was another calculation that hurt the ability, or the ability of a donor who gave that kind of a gift in large amounts anyway, to deduct the entire amount. I remember doing a computer program on this to address this question, because part of my background involves something really archaic called, arcane I should say, called planned giving. And so the question was, well, how is this going to affect your large donors who give millions and millions and millions of dollars of stock, some of which have a zero cost basis because it was a family stock company. So the tax law during the Clinton administration did change in that sense. But I also have to point out that you could give credit or blame Clinton, depending on your perspective, but it was Congress who actually was the writer of that, you know that. But just so we, and I take that line from perhaps one of your favorite people, Ronald Reagan, who famously said, "I didn't raise taxes; it's Congress who does it." So it's a joint effort. So
good. So with that, I wanted to just, I don't know, you probably are familiar with Francis Bacon. And Jason, I don't know if you've run into Francis Bacon, but
He's not old
Well,
enough.
I've run
Oh,
into
he's-
Frank Bacon. It's interesting that we'd be talking about fraud in the same breath as that guy, but I don't think it's the same Francis
No.
Bacon.
so there's something called the Dictionary of National Biography, which is an English thing. And it's quite, I don't know if you've ever run into the Dictionary of National Biography.
I haven't, but I am interested in biography. So
And so what it is it's updated every intervals of many decades, and you'll get a king of England will get 2 pages, right? It's just the highlights. Whatever. Francis Bacon, from memory, gets like 50 pages.
What's
It's
the publication? What's
the Dictionary of National Biography, and 40 or 50 pages. Francis Bacon. Some credit him, he was a gifted writer, he was a gifted philosopher, he was a gifted scientist. Some indeed give him credit for, is it the empirical method of, I forget exactly what method it is, but he was a major league, there you go, scientist, as I said, and thinker. And then he was very much involved in politics. And so he's also a very witty writer. So one of his sayings was what I had up there on the screen there, is that in order to appreciate light, you have to have obviously a dark background to see the light. And in looking at the Clinton Foundation, and then the vicious treatment, I think, vicious and unfair treatment of Wounded Warrior project, we have that dark background. And now hopefully through the next several slides here, we're going to see some light. So with that, if we go to the next slide.
Boy, that's a very interesting quote to be attributed to Frank Bacon, because the Frank Bacon that I know seems to be very focused on the darkness aspect of that.
All right, well, he was technically Sir Francis Bacon. Anyway, I put up here, Doug, I took the liberty of chopping your resume down a little bit just because I wanted to fit it on one slide. All right, and I put it up in this way, and we do these slides because it's very useful for our viewers to be able to have this presentation to look at afterwards, where they don't necessarily have to write notes, or they can write notes. So obviously not reading what's on here, if you could just introduce yourself to our viewership and explain how you got to be involved in Charity Land, and really take a few minutes on it. And I think our viewers would be keenly interested.
nobody goes to school thinking, or at least when I went to school thinking he or she wanted to be in charities. They wanted to do good things, but they didn't think that way back then. I think that I speak to a lot of younger audiences these days, people who want to do good things in the world. And back when I was in college, I thought the way I could best affect the world, from my perspective in a positive way, would be involved with politics. I don't think that's as true today as it was then. I think people who want to change the world today think of the nonprofit sector. And so it's become a much more important part of our daily conversation than it was a decade or a couple of decades ago. I fell into it. I was, after college, doing what a lot of people do after college, which is to say a bunch of things that didn't add up to a whole lot. But I finally started to settle down, and I was involved with John Hancock, which at the time was selling life insurance, but also becoming more of an investment kind of an organization. They were starting to do more in the world of looking at a total picture for someone's financial future. And I got involved with part of that. And at the same time, this would be in 1980, I was invited to a dinner at my private high school, which was Exeter. And at the time, they were celebrating, or about to start their celebration for their 200th anniversary. So I came to the dinner because I had sold an insurance policy to someone who was a big deal at Exeter. And I didn't know anything about fundraising or anything at the time, but he invited me to the dinner. So I went to the dinner, and it was great. And they talked about the school and its future and the kind of thing. And it was all new to me. And then he called me back about 2 or 3 days later, and he said, "Do you know why you were invited to the dinner?" I said, "I have no idea, but it was a good dinner. I think it was steak. It was really good." And he said, "Well, yeah, thank you, but we were hoping that you'd help us out." And I said, "Sure, what would you like me to do? I don't know anything, but I'll do whatever you ask." He said, "Well, we'd like you to talk to some people," and this was in New Hampshire at the time. "If you'd be so kind as to talk to 5 people and ask them for a gift to our bicentennial campaign." I said, I'd be more than happy to. And when you're in the insurance business or financial services business, you have a schedule that's your own, so you can work this kind of a thing out. And I did, and I went around the state and talked to 5 people that I was given, the names of people I was given. And I remember being asked to ask for $1,000 from each person. But if I couldn't get that, then $100 or something in between 0 and 1,000 would be fine, just to get them going. And I have to tell you, Charles, that I visited 5 people, and every single person I asked said yes to $1,000. So I said, this is really great. So I called these people back at Exeter, and I said, they all said they would support this campaign. And they were happy about that. I didn't know whether they would be happy or just lukewarm about it, but they were very ecstatic. And I didn't have any problem asking people for money. Remember, I was already selling, so this was like easy because it was an organization that I really liked, and I didn't have anything to give them back, but I did have something to tell them, a story. And I remember talking to each person, getting a different story about their own world and their values and how they really, really wanted to help this organization. I thought, this is really cool. I'm unfamiliar with this world. And so I went back to the school and I said, I wouldn't mind talking to some more people. And I did. And I started to think more and more about how charity makes the world turn. It's not just finance, it's not just law, it's not just politics, it's also charity. And it really, really turned me on. At that point, I was maybe 5 years out of college, and for the first time, I couldn't sleep at night because of what I thought I could do for the world. I thought I could do a lot for the world in the world of politics, but for much of what you've been going through here, and maybe it's the yin and the yang of it, but I also felt that there was a lot of cynicism in the world of politics, and this is even in the 1970s. Now, this is just after Watergate. I was involved in democratic politics in the state, and just looked around and said, I don't know that I want this to be my life. It wasn't Democrat, it wasn't Republican, it's just that it felt empty to me. That isn't to say a political career, regardless of your political persuasion, can't be fulfilling. It is for a lot of people, and I'm happy about that. But it wasn't for me. What was for me was the idea of helping society through this world of nonprofits and understanding more about philanthropy. So I learned a lot about that, and I taught myself a lot about that. This would be in about 1979, 1980, and ever since I've been involved with, in some form or another, the nonprofit world. And it's not been a straight line. I was asked to give a talk at Exeter at a meeting here in New York for their alumni about how do you get from A to B, and I said, it's not a straight line. You know, you guys are coming out of school right now, going into college. You have an idea of who you want to be, and that's great, you should, but by the same token, in all probability, you won't do that. And if you do, you won't get there in the way you think you're going to get there. Life is too wild for that. And that was my story, and I think it's pretty much true for a lot of people. So I got involved as a donor to begin with at a young age. I got involved as an advisor to people who wanted to be donors. I got involved as a director of development. I later got involved as a person who invested money for charities, their endowments and so forth. And I also got involved on the technical area where I wrote a computer program for one of the large software companies on what we called planned giving at the time. That's how I know about the alternative minimum tax calculation. I got involved in the board level as well. And after all of that time, that didn't happen in just a short period of time, it took about 20, 30 years. But after all of that time, I came to understand that the board is really where it's at. This is where the big decisions are made. If I were a fundraising consultant, which I was for a long time, I could say, well, you need to do another letter and it has to be in October as opposed to November, so you hit the timing for the end of year correctly, that kind of tactical information. But I had to realize then that the board would have to oversee the budget that would allow that to happen. So it always came back to the board, and I began to realize that through the 80s and felt that I wanted to know more about board governance. And so since, let's say, the early 90s and mid 90s anyway, I have been concentrating on board activity at charities. And as a result, have found a lot of things that have been really not great. From what you're describing at the Clinton Foundation as being fairly malicious activity to basically bad activity but without the malice involved.
I like how you describe it. I like how you describe it as fairly malicious activity. It was extremely malicious activity and unfair.
Well, we could have a long conversation about that, and I would have to submit that you would know a lot more about it than I do in terms of the malice.
Charles certainly would.
Or Charles. I'm not as inclined to go as far, and I hope you'll respect that, because I do have a fondness for the liberal sector of our country, but I also have a fondness for truth and looking into things, and so I think we'll be on the same ground there. But I have to just point that out.
My role on the show is generally to make wise-ass comments.
Oh, good. So at any rate, where was I? In terms of understanding charities, I wrote a book in 1996 called The Art of Planned Giving, because at that time, planned giving is a fairly complicated area of the fundraising world. It's not one you normally just jump into, but I did. And I had the benefit from coming from the John Hancock Financial Services Department, which was fairly nascent at that time in the late 70s and early 80s. And so I had the perspective of the broader financial picture, and so planned giving seemed to fit into my area of interest. And so I learned a lot about that. I learned all about the idea of planned giving, and it's called The Art of Planned Giving. Thanks for bringing it up. I don't have any, it's like over 25. But it's called The Art of Planned Giving because at the time everybody was talking about the technicalities involved with planned giving. Remember, Charles had mentioned the alternative minimum tax? You would think that was the hottest topic at cocktail parties, when of course it wasn't. And if you go to cocktail parties and you say, well, I work in planned giving, and you know, this alternative minimum tax is exciting as all get out, you are going to be alone for the entire night at the cocktail party. And so I learned that quickly, but for me it was a passion. And the issue was that there were so many people who were coming out of the financial services world who wanted to get into this area and kind of advise charities and make money doing that. I said, no, there is more than just the technical transactions going on here. There's an art, and the art is the ability to talk to people. And I went back to in my head to the people I spoke with for Exeter. These people had a passion. They didn't, do you realize out of the first 5 people I talked to, and probably for the next 50 people I talked to on behalf of Exeter, the idea of a tax deduction never came up once. Yeah. Okay, it was not about that. At any rate, that was why The Art of Planned Giving was written. It was written in anger and in response to all of the techno types who were trying to come up and make it a transaction instead of a gift. You said earlier that donors oftentimes don't have the purity of motive. They don't. Let's get that straight. They have all sorts of motives. And so tax deductions might be part of it, being a part of the set that is going to the ball at the Metropolitan Museum of Art might be part of it. There could be a lot of things going on there. The idea of helping the world be a better place. You know, I do a lot of work with ethical decision making in the world of fundraising, especially in planned giving. The very first code of ethics, the very first platform is ensuring donative intent. And I tell people, yes, that's all great, but how do you feel donative intent? How are you going to know the person's purity just by talking to him or her? And the answer is you're not. And you're going to take the gift for the most part. Now, there are lines you shouldn't cross as a solicitor, but by the same, strong ones, but by the same token, you can't really extract donative intent. You know, it's going to be a mixture of things, and that's fine. But no matter what, it is an art, and you've got to get inside and understand a person's head when he or she is making a philanthropic gift. I think that's extremely important. And so that sold pretty well. It was forwarded by Terry Simmons, one of my heroes who died this past year, an attorney in Texas. And he was an attorney. He loved the law. He was all about the where the commas go and where the quotes go and where everything. And yet he understood where the art of this process was. But then I started to say, is there something wrong with charities? And that is to say, as I got more involved with the boards, my concern was these guys, a lot of them don't know what they're doing. I remember being at a meeting of people where someone said that there were 9 million board seats at charities around the United States, and almost half of them were unfilled, and isn't this too bad? And based on what I had been learning over the last several years, I said to myself and to the people around the table, I said, well, what's really too bad is that the people who are filling the seats are not always aware of what their jobs are. And so that's something we really have to pay attention to. I wrote the second book called Charity on Trial, and that was a book about fraud. It was a book about people who were doing bad things at charities. And the granddaddy of it all was the United Way of America at the time, Bill Aramone, who really, I think, is the beginning of our modern era of skepticism in charity. This was during the 1980s and early 1990s. William Aramone was a brilliant man and a very accomplished man and a marketer, and made the United Way what it is today. We have to give him credit for that, there's no question. But at the same time, he went to jail for 10 years for having been found guilty on several counts of fraud and other things, and misusing the charity's money. I believe that's the beginning of our skepticism. Now, a couple of years later, there was a couple of years before, right when I was writing The Art of Planned Giving, there was a lawsuit in Texas. It became called the Texas lawsuit, but basically what happened was, and going back to the planned giving vernacular for just a second, there's something called gift annuities that you can do as a donor to help a charity. You can give them a certain amount of money, the charity will give you an annuity for your lifetime. It's calculated in such a way so that there's something left afterwards, so that there's something for the charity. There was a lawsuit in Texas challenging charities' ability to do this, just to make a complicated story short. And so what happened was I went to Congress with Terry Simmons and some others to argue for bills that would protect charities from these kinds of accusations and lawsuits. They both passed, 100%. You talk about Congress today, this was a different world. We went down there and people were praising charities, thanking us for the role we were playing, and I said, well, I'm just a tiny pebble on this huge beach. I'm no one compared to, let's say, first of all, Terry and others. But collectively, I think what the Congress people were saying was, thank you for the world that you're protecting in the nonprofit world. I don't think you'd feel that way today, or you wouldn't get that feeling from Congress today. That lawsuit was seminal because it allows charities now to raise money in a way they should, but it also brought a lot of skepticism to how charities work. Even though the charities were found to have done a good job, even though the two bills that were passed by Congress were passed unanimously by Congress and unanimously in the Texas state legislature. George Bush was the governor at the time he signed it. Bill Clinton was the president at the time he signed it. I don't know if there has ever been a moment since, certainly, or even before that time, when the United States was so unified on this one question. So we were very lucky to get that passed. But that really made me think, what's going on here? The Red Cross after 9/11, abysmal behavior, abysmal. Bill Aramone, a lot of, they're just, when I started to look into it, the Smithsonian, a lot of places are not playing right. And I come back to that soft, as I have been told, but I think very hard underbelly of reality, and that is we have to have a unique charitable ethos if we're going to run charities correctly. That isn't to say that charities shouldn't pay decent salaries, that people are able to live correctly. That isn't to say that the charity shouldn't invest in their technology and overhead correctly. All of that is a different question. But that said, we are still in a different part of our society called the nonprofit sector. We call it the third sector. It's carved out, separate from business and separate from government. And it's my hope that we can protect that while still being very, very realistic about how the charitable sector can work with both other sectors.
Now, I know you've got two other books, though.
One is all about the charitable ethos at the nonprofit level. The nonprofit, the purpose and promise of charities is the third one, the Nonprofit Challenge, which is really, from my perspective, it was the most important because it really dealt with what I consider the most important thing, the ethical underpinning of the nonprofit world. Unlike business and unlike government, the nonprofit world can be and should be pretty pure. We don't have to worry about political issues, although in reality there are political issues. We don't have to worry about profits, even though in reality we have to worry about being business-like. By the same token, we have this sector where we are able to examine questions in a way that is unadorned by the problems affecting both business and government. And so as a result, we should not just be another part of a checklist on some congressman's or congresswoman's concerns. We need to be the leading light of how we think. You've just spent about 15 minutes or half an hour earlier on an important question, and that is, why don't we get to the bottom of things? Why is it that we don't understand things? Why aren't we being told things? And clearly, there is a partisanship, even in our reporting. I personally believe that, and I used to be in the news business, I was part of the 5 years after college, that there really is no objective reporting anywhere. If, for example, if I'm saying it's not raining out and someone else is saying it is sunny out, we could both be right, but we're conveying something different in someone's mind. And so it's how we tell the narrative, and the job of a journalist is to provide as much context as possible, so that you don't have someone going in saying, hey, we're looking at sarin gas victims and they're not protected. You know, that kind of simple question should be able to be answered. And so I think the quest for truth isn't only in the nonprofit world, it's everywhere. But I think within ourselves, we owe it to ourselves to have that quest always. We wake up every day saying we don't know everything and we want to find out more. We get that. And the nonprofit world, I think, is a special sector for that reason. And you just brought up abusing donor intent. I can say it now publicly that was not my choice of title. It's about a lawsuit at Princeton University. And my choice of title had been Tiger by the Tail.
I like that one.
I thought it was great.
Because it's about Princeton.
I thought it was perfect, but the publisher didn't like it, and so we went with it. It's got the Princeton colors, although we went one off on the color in case we got sued. The essence of this story is I think, mind-boggling. The family gave $35 million of A&P stock. Many of your readers and listeners won't know what A&P is.
The supermarket?
See, you're saying, yeah, that was sort of like history.
It became ShopRite.
Yes, no, you're right. It was at one point, for 50 years, I should say, one point, the largest supermarket in the United States going.
Yeah,
50 years.
Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company.
Yeah, and they added the Pacific on to make it a national company. Anyway, one of the heiresses of that company came in when the trust was dissolved. There was a trust her grandfather had started. It dissolved after the last of the children died, and at that point the woman, Marie Robertson, inherited about $100 million, between $90 and $100 million in one lump sum. And she was already pretty wealthy with the income she was getting from the trust.
Well, and all the coupon clipping as well.
And what year? That was like in the 1960s or something?
That was right. That was 1961. The last son died in 1959, I believe, and it took 2 years to unravel the trust. And two of the people were childless. So 2/5, there were 5 children, 2/5 of $1 billion went to start it wasn't the Robertson Foundation. I'll think of it in a minute. I'm thinking Huntington, but that's not right. But a huge foundation that's located here in New York. But she got about $100 million, $35 million. Her husband went to Princeton, and they were, okay, you'll like this. He was, the granddaughter who lives in Berkeley said, oh my God, I think my parents or my grandparents were really Republican, and I hate that idea. And I said, look, don't worry. They were Republican and Democrat. They admired both Eisenhower and Kennedy equally. And so what they were really interested in was basically going out and saying, this is, the American way is a good way, and we want to export it. And we're going to do that by beefing up the Princeton program for international relations. It was the Woodrow Wilson School. And what they did was the gift made the Woodrow Wilson School fully endowed, the graduate program at the Woodrow Wilson School. And what happened, though, this was in 1961, as it turns out, Princeton really wasn't using the money well, or it wasn't using it the way the donor wanted to. Now, if someone were sitting here next to me from Princeton, he or she would disagree with that. But the facts are what I found in the deposition. You say you resource everything, so do I. And then I resource the source because I don't want to just use anybody because he's quoted somewhere. I did that with you. That's why you're still in the book. You look like you were a pretty credible resource. This is before we even talked.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if you even know this. I was using something you said about the Clinton Foundation. In fact, we'll get to that. But so I resourced the sources to make sure that, because I'm going up against essentially here the legal department of the Princeton University and the people they've hired. Okay?
Which was what firm?
Get to me on that a little bit later.
All right.
Okay, I'm trying to remember. It was a New Jersey firm, and they're very prominent in New Jersey. Okay. They're very prominent around the country. It's just that I'm having a moment here. I might be a little older than you. You were very kind. But what was alleged right away was that the money wasn't being used well, and Princeton said, yes, it is. And what was really being done here, and
that's a super strong legal argument.
Yeah. Well, it's amazing. Not being an attorney, I'm thinking I'm going to be bombarded with legal arguments and technology and technical legalese, and oftentimes it's not that. And I'm glad. But in this particular case, Charles Robertson, the father, had been complaining since the late 1960s, and saying, well, there's like a lot of people are going to this school, but they're not becoming career diplomats, they're not going into the world of diplomacy. And as it turns out, Princeton wasn't really that concerned about those people going into the world of diplomacy. And it was obvious that that was the case because through the process of discovery, the Robertson team found that the application to come into the school did not include a question about what they wanted to do with that degree. Now, this is crucial because the gift was made on the condition that there would be an emphasis given to the students about going into the world of diplomacy to spread American democracy around the world. That was done in large part through the Peace Corps, but also through the State Department and other federal agencies. And I remember one very interesting quote that the father, who wrote a lot of long letters to a lot of people, wrote to the dean of the Woodrow Wilson School. And he said that he discovered that on the golf course that the son of one of his golfing partners had just gotten a job at an investment firm, and he had graduated from the Woodrow Wilson School. And he wrote the letter back to the school saying, I don't know why you're letting so many people go into the school and not go into the foreign service or into government service. I guess if there's a dentist who works on the president's teeth, he might qualify. So the question of what Princeton needed to do was becoming more and more important to the father who had given the money. It was a joint gift, actually. Actually, to be hyper-technical, it was a gift from the wife, but it was a joint gift. And so the question of what they were doing with this money was becoming more and more of a problem. Princeton would have you believe that in 2001, the son woke up one day and said, there's a problem. That wasn't the case. That's what they told me for that book on the nonprofit challenge, because I wrote a little article about it there. They said that basically 40 years later, and now the wayward son has a problem, and he is a problem. That was their narrative. Oh, and I went into this thinking, Princeton's Princeton. They're great. You know, they would never screw up like this. And then one day, when I was teaching at NYU, I was also teaching with somebody who said that he was going to work on the Princeton case. And I said, oh, so you're going to support the Princeton position? He said, no, I'm supporting the family. And I thought, really? I don't understand this. And this was Bill Josephson, who used to be the attorney, the head of the Charities Bureau in New York State under the Attorney General's office. And I said, Bill, I don't understand. He said, well, you wouldn't believe the facts of the matter. Now, Bill, who is a brilliant guy, very solid Democrat, used to know the Shrivers pretty well and really believed in the Kennedy mission of everything. And then he came back and said this, and I thought, there's got to be something here, because you're too smart to ignore this. So I began to look into it, and then, amazingly, about a year later, Bill Robertson calls me, because I had interviewed him for the Nonprofit Challenge, and he said he would get me all this information, and he didn't. He's a bit of a procrastinator. He's a good guy, but he never got me the information. And so I couldn't put anything that he said was about the case because I didn't have the real source. I could say he said it, but I couldn't say it was true. So I went to press and did that, and then he, about a year after this was published, he said, I'm glad you published it, and I see that the part that you wrote about me wasn't complete. And I said, yeah, because you didn't get back to me. And he said, well, what I'd like to do is have a book written about the case. So I said to him, I'd be glad to. This was the case of the century for lawsuits. But this is an honor. And so what I did was I said, look, I'm going to come down and visit you. He was in Florida at the time. And I said, in an agreement, I said, look, I want to write this book, but you are going to have no say over what's written, because you are not going to make this about you. Now, as it turns out, I had to interview him a lot. And what I did with everybody I interviewed, with this book and the one I'm writing right now, Wounded Warrior, is I said that I would get back to them and get them to approve of the quote I'm attributing to them.
Yeah.
If it's, I mean, if I'm having an interview, if it's coming from a
Published source,
source, that's different. But as a result, I was quoting him a lot, so I basically showed him all of the quotes in the context, was like a lot of the book. But what I told him was that you will have nothing to say about the editing of this book, because I want to be able to say that's true about the way I've written it. I want it to be true ethically, and I want any side deals or any smirks or any winks or a nod. It's just going to be, that's the way it is. Two, you're going to have to provide the information you said you'd provide, a few years ago. And he said, I'll get you anything you want, and I'll give you access to anybody you want. That he could. I mean, he really did. He came through. He really did come through on this. And he said, I think what you're going to find is that you could come out and say we came out on the wrong. I think what you're going to find is, given all of your investigation, that we were in the right. And it turns out I did end up thinking that Princeton was more in the wrong than the Robertson family. I think Princeton had more of an obligation to live up to the standards of that gift agreement than it did. And so I began to really see, if Princeton can do this, then anybody can. And so every charity is suspect, no matter what. So having written that book, having been at Columbia for some years after that, I then see the CBS stories and the New York Times.
I'm going to jump in here. You're
Yeah.
being too modest. Explain to our audience, if you would, what you did at NYU and then what you did at Columbia, because you're jumping over that, and it's important.
I was fortunate because at the time I was living in Washington. I was a consultant down there working with organizations like the Smithsonian, like the World Wildlife Fund, and others, big ones. And I was really enjoying my life down in Washington. And one day I get a call from someone I had as a client when I was doing investments. The world is small. And she was working at New York University as an adjunct professor. They had just started a nonprofit program. And she wanted to know if I wanted to teach in it, especially with ethical decision making. I said, sure, I'll come up. It was a once a week thing, and so I took the train up here every week. I now live in New York, but then I lived in Washington. In the late 2000s, the job of academic director became open. They had shifted the program enough, it had grown enough at that point, and I was asked to take that job, and I did, and that brought me here. That was a full-time job, and I came to New York, and I kind of, in my heart, always wanted to live in New York. And I'm glad I'm here. I met my wife here, and I'm really, really glad I'm here. So I came and worked at NYU. Then I got the call from Bill Robertson, and I knew I couldn't do both at the same time. So I made a difficult decision, wrote the book, left NYU. As soon as I finished, on the day that I finished the last word of the first draft of the manuscript, I get a call from Columbia. It was serendipity, but it was still the timing of it. And, well, we have an opening in our faculty. Would you like to teach here? I said I'd be very honored to. I thought I would go back to NYU, but things were not the same there. Have a high regard for NYU, but I was really glad to go to Columbia. And so, knowing that this would be a full-time activity, doing the work at I'm not on there anymore. That's what it used to be. they call it fundraising management now. Yeah, well, that's okay. That's okay. Yeah, they've now changed that. I wanted them to change it to nonprofit management because we were doing so much work on nonprofit activity. And it wasn't just fundraising. Fundraising's, of course, the backbone of any charitable enterprise. But I was teaching board governance, so I wasn't really teaching fundraising except when I was filling in for other places or other teachers. So I was doing the work of basically nonprofit management and from an oversight perspective from the board. And through that, I was able to talk about all the fraud that takes place and what people should be aware of, not only for people who work at a charity, but for a donor who needs to know more about it. Even when I wrote the book, Abusing Donor, Abusing Donor Intent, I still wasn't fully aware of all of the fraud that takes place. And so I was able to use that in the classroom, and every day there was something new. Every single year, every single semester, I began the course by saying, here's our syllabus, but I'm going to tell you this much right now. We will not follow it completely because something will happen in the next few months that will take our attention away, that will be germane to what we're learning about nonprofit board governance. And it did. Every single one. Was it Lance Armstrong, whether it was the Cancer Research Organization, or whether it was Wounded Warrior Project. So one day, I was at Columbia, and it was a Tuesday night, and I got home after teaching, and I was home around 10 o'clock, and I got a text message from a good friend of mine, Laura Fredericks, who teaches also fundraising and has written some good books on fundraising. I adore the woman. She's just one of my closest friends and closest colleagues. She writes to me and says, did you see the Wounded Warrior story tonight on CBS News? And I had not seen it, and I didn't know anything about it. So I bring it up on the internet and watched the first of what would become 3 stories, and it was scathing. They led their story. Wounded Warrior Project, where is the money going? And I thought, oh my God. And I've done 20 years of investigating charities, saying what's going on at these. My first response, Charles, was these guys have really done some bad things. I mean, CBS would not do a story this way unless they had their T's crossed and their I's dotted. So I wrote back to my friend Laura and said, look, you're right, this was a pretty scathing thing. But then something else happened. As it happens, about 4 weeks earlier, I had been called by a guy by the name of Dave Phillips, who is a reporter for the New York Times. And he and I spent about an hour on the telephone, longer than most of the time I spend with reporters on the telephone. But I get a call a lot from reporters about what's going on in charities. And he said, I'm going to do a story on the Wounded Warrior Project. So, okay, I didn't know much about it. I knew that they were big and they were growing. And I had been asked a couple of times before that by some people, I think Bloomberg News maybe, well, they're growing really fast, and is there something wrong about the way they grow and all the money they're using and so forth? And I said, well, I looked into it on a 990 level. And I said, well, basically, yeah, they're growing fast, but I don't see anything wrong. I don't know that there's nothing wrong. I haven't done any real investigation, but I don't see anything wrong based on what I'm saying. So if you're looking at the same thing I'm looking at, I'd say you're not seeing anything wrong. That was basically the essence of it. Dave Phillips went in a little bit more differently, and he said, I'm going to go down there and talk to these people, and I'm going to get an inside track on things, and I'm going to find out more about it. I want to get your take on their fundraising, on their program, and so forth like that. And I said, we talked a long time. I said, look, in my view, there should be no Wounded Warrior Project, because when someone goes off to war, he or she should expect to come back, if he or she is injured, to be taken care of by the government. I just feel that's part of the deal one makes when one goes to war. Well, we don't live up to that ideal. And without criticizing the world for it, I get it, because it's a big, big promise. The VA is meant to do that, but it can't do it the way it needs to be done. So nonprofits come up. They fill the gaps. And the Wounded Warrior Project fills that gap. And it fills it rather magnanimously, I might add. So I'm thinking, this is a pretty good story. Dave Phillips is very kind, very upbeat about it, very knowledgeable. He's a very smart man, a Pulitzer Prize winner in his own right. And so then I haven't heard from him. That's not weird. But the story comes up. my first reaction was, I should email Dave. He might not know about this. And so I did. I didn't hear back from him. But as it turns out, the following morning, that Wednesday, January 28th, I believe it was, the front page story above the fold was about the Wounded Warrior Project with Dave Phillips's byline. I said, well, he obviously knew what was going on. And then that same day, during the morning news and then the evening news, there were 2 more segments about the Wounded Warrior Project. Then, as it happens, that week, I had written an article about Charity Navigator, one of the ratings services of charities, and it was scathing because I don't like Charity Navigator, and I started Charity Navigator, but that's another issue.
That's important. It's really important.
Well, I'll get to that. Why that is important in a second. But I wrote this article, and I didn't write the title or the headline. Someone else did for the Chronicle of Philanthropy, which is the newspaper for the nonprofit world, in addition to the Nonprofit Times. So they're both, I think, equal partners in this reporting business for philanthropy and nonprofits. But the headline was, Charity Navigator, grow up or shut up, or grow up or shut down, or something like that. I didn't write it, but that was basically a good summation of my argument, because I said, they're doing nothing to help the donors understand things. Well, I had done this without ever seeing the CBS report, but as it turns out, I was able to just throw in a line or two about it. I called the editor up and I said, well, this just came out, so I just like to add on to it, because CBS was using Charity Navigator as a resource. According to Charity Navigator, there it is, shut down. According to Charity Navigator, Wounded Warrior Project is doing this, this, and this wrong. So they were sourcing Charity Navigator on this. And that same week, I had written an article that was pretty scathing against Charity Navigator. So as a result, someone, Peter Honerkamp, who basically founded one of the signature programs at Wounded Warrior Project back in the mid-2000s called Soldier Ride, called me. He had read the article in the Nonprofit Times about Charity Navigator, and he asked me to call the people at Wounded Warrior Project. I said I'd be glad to. So I called Steve Nardizzi and Al Giordano, the CEO and the COO, that next Saturday. This was within the same week of all of this. Yes, that was the 28th, and I think earlier it was the 27th. Yes, it was all the same few days. And they said, look, this is like so not us. We do not understand where these reporters are getting this information. Steve Nardizzi would later tell me that he watched these stories on CBS and wondered if I turned down the sound and just saw things, I would not believe they're talking about Wounded Warrior Project. This is not us.
Fake news.
On CBS?
They are constantly broadcasting. Anyway, continue.
Well, it's funny you bring up that phrase, and I'll come back to it. But they said, look, what we'd like you to do is we'd like you to do a top-to-bottom investigation of our organization. I said, oh my God, I'm at Columbia right now, and I'm full-time, and I'm doing the director's job, which is a lot of non-teaching and a lot of administrative stuff and a lot of non-fun stuff. I love the students and I love the faculty. But administration of the university, oh my gosh. But I said, I've got a full-time job, and I know what you're talking about would take 6 months of full-time activity, and I'd have to hire a couple of people on top of that. They said, look, that's okay. What we're going to do, and what we've already done, we've engaged someone to do a forensic accounting of our numbers for the last number of years. That's going to take at least a month. So let's rediscuss this in a month. I said, fine, let's do that. But I said, I was about to hang up, and I said, but I have to tell you something. I don't really care who pays me. I'm going to be honest. And you guys could come up looking pretty bad here. And I'll tell you, from what I've seen, you are pretty bad. So if I'm going to do this, it's not going to be a process of whitewashing you. I need you to know that. And they said, music to our ears. We want you to be as honest and as critical as you possibly can. That was music to my ears. So, okay, fine, as long as we're on the same page there. So a month later, I got a call from the Chronicle of Philanthropy, Timothy Sandoval. What did you think of the news? This was on a Thursday evening, I believe the 10th of March. What news? Well, the CEO and the COO of Wounded Warrior Project were fired. I said, what happened? Well, we don't know, but they held a news conference this afternoon, and they said that Nardizzi and Giordano were gone. I said, really? I guess there goes that project. I didn't know how I'd fit it in anyway, but there goes that project. And I thought, this is really weird, because the headline really was that, and it was Simpson Thatcher that they had hired to do this, along with FTI, but Simpson Thatcher was the vocal part of this, came up and said basically there was nothing wrong. Nothing wrong. All right, so I get that. So why did you fire these two guys? And Timothy Sandoval and I were scratching our heads, and no one knew. So I'm thinking, something here is awry. And the person who called me to begin with, Peter Honerkamp, he called me back and said, what bleep, bleep, bleep is going on? I said, I have no idea. Did Steve and Al do something really, really horrible that no one wants to talk about? Is there something that we're missing here? I've only talked to them for a few minutes on the telephone. I have no idea. But Peter said, look, I know those guys, they're straight up guys. And on top of that, the report from Simpson Thatcher came back and said nothing was wrong, except for some minor improvement opportunities, which any investigation would show, any kind of evaluation would show. That's nothing new, and it's not news, and it certainly wouldn't be grounds for firing the two top people. Now you have to keep in mind and remember that both Steve and Al were the architects of the success of this organization. They went from about, I'll say conservatively, $10 or $15 million a year up to almost $400 million a year in a 10-year period. Well, you say that's a lot of growth, and a lot of the people, as I said earlier, who were calling me saying, is there something going awry here? And I thought, no, they're just going quickly. But another thing to keep in mind when you are a charity, especially the kind that Wounded Warrior is, their mission is huge. They're trying to fill the gaps where the VA is falling down.
You raise a good point. What we should do, Jason, is put up that slide up that has Wounded Warrior Project. The next slide after, while he's talking, so that people can.
It's important to know that this mission is huge, and one of the problems, Charles, with
next. Yeah, there we go. No, next. We'll go back to that. There you go.
One of the problems in any organization is that the board doesn't understand fully the mission and the scope of it and how far and deep it goes. I ask people to think about 25, 30, 50 years, maybe 100 years out, based on the kind of organization they are. People don't do that. Think 3 to 6 months. That's what business cycles are. And so they can't think that way because there's a larger question at play. And one of those questions is, these people who are coming home in their 20s are going to live for a very long time and be disabled, and their caregivers are going to need help as well as they. So the question is, if they're going to play a role, they have to think long term. They have to play the long game. And Steve Nardizzi and Al Giordano both did. And am I saying that they were saints? Absolutely not. You don't grow that quickly without making some enemies. But I have now spent 2 years on this investigation of my own. I've looked into all sorts of emails. I've talked to all sorts of people. I have in my possession, not secret documents, but confidential documents that back up all of this story. They did nothing really wrong. All they did was do too much right. And it got under the skin of many people, including the Department of Defense, including other people in nonprofits.
Well, one thing I just want, for some of our viewers who may not understand the significance of this, a charity's purposes, authorized purposes, are set forth, if it is a nonprofit corporation, in its articles of incorporation. And a lot of times the Clinton Foundation authorized purposes are not specific enough. The Obama Foundations are not remotely specific enough. Here, this is one of the very few articles of incorporation I've seen that would be this specific to lay out all of, this is lifted from their articles of incorporation. And I commend the architects who did it that way, because it's so important to go beyond, we're going to be a charitable organization, to say exactly what are you going to do and what are your specific authorized purposes. Then beyond those, these are the activities that are they're to carry out in furtherance of their purposes. People elide the distinction between your purposes and your activities. Activities have to further the purposes. They're not, and it's an important distinction that the Clintons use in their charity world to try to say that they can do whatever the hell they want to do.
I want to get to the point where we juxtapose those two because that'll be fun. And on that, we are 100% in alignment. But getting back, you are right to point out the specificity of this. And it's not just because it's specific, but it's also thoughtful because it's thoughtful. And one thing about Wounded Warrior Project has been that they've always been very thoughtful. They know what they're trying to accomplish. Clearly, they're going to run into obstacles in accomplishing their objectives. But Steve and Al and the senior leadership team that they had with them always played straight. Okay, as I say, they're not going to please everybody all the time. By the way, when I teach ethics, I say the goal isn't to get everybody agreeing. The goal is to get everybody respecting, because we talk about two good people disagreeing, that old phrase. Well, if we're going to mean that, we have to actually allow for people to disagree with us.
Right.
And right now, our current conversation nationally doesn't permit that, and that's too bad. I think if we paid more attention to that, then some of the substance of what we're agreeing about could be better dealt with, but that's another issue. The point is that these two guys were running a Class A charity, the largest veteran service organization in the United States by far. And it wasn't because they wanted to raise a lot of money for the sake of raising money. They were instituting programs that were helping veterans, really helping veterans in a way that the VA couldn't and wouldn't. And again, I know, and I spend a lot of time criticizing the Veterans Administration in my book, but it's not about criticizing the VA here. It's about allowing a nonprofit to do what it should be doing to help the veterans in a way they're not otherwise being helped. And they were doing that magnanimously. So there's an irony when I said, oh, look, Steve and Al, I don't want you to think I'm going to whitewash you, because I feel like that's I haven't whitewashed them, but they've come out somewhat heroic in this process. And I didn't mean for that to happen. I didn't mean for Bill Robertson to come out heroically either. And the other, all he did was his job of trying to find out where the money was going. He wasn't trying to be a prima donna or anything like that, like Princeton was claiming. And similarly, Steve and Al were never, ever out for their own aggrandizement, always for the servicemen. And you know, one of the funny theories that came out, I think I know I did put this in there, in the book, somebody said about the board and the Steve and Al thing, because there was a lot of tension, and the board thing is a really big problem in this whole process. But somebody said, well, the board were successful business people and or military people. They had high ranks in the military. A lot of the people they're serving in the veteran community are not of that level. And on top of that, Steve and Al were able to connect to these guys on their level. They were able, I mean, I have talked to so many people, dozens and dozens of people who either worked for Wounded Warrior or who are Wounded Warriors or veterans themselves. And they cannot tell me enough how much they appreciated the work of Steve and Al.
Yeah. Now you mentioned, let's go back one slide, Jason, if we can. You mentioned that you founded Charity Navigator and you're not so happy with Charity Navigator. Now this is a very summary comparison of the three main rating services, Charity Watch, GuideStar, and Charity Navigator. And what we do here, just a lot of people are not that happy with numbers in our audience.
Yes.
So to make it simple, red is bad. Okay. Now, the thing to point out here, the thing that just jumps out at me, it's very similar to the experience. I started exposing fraud looking at the corporate world, and the first one was General Electric, which is a very big company. And it was actively rated. It had AAA ratings from Moody's and S&P. These are gigantic corporations.
Very big fraud.
Big fraud, big rating service. But the big rating people, with all the experience they had and all the resources, the financial and other resources they had, they were not equipped. They missed the GE fraud, I think. Now here, though, I look at this, and a number of these, Charity Watch, I think was the first one, is still today run by a very small group of people.
Yeah, Daniel Borishoff at Charity Watch, he's out in the Midwest, very small. And very superficial in what they look at.
Right.
But that isn't to say he's a bad guy.
Right.
That's
I'm
a
not
different
saying
thing.
that either.
Yeah.
Then GuideStar is bigger in personnel, the biggest, but if you look down at the bottom, they had a big problem in the most recent period, ended December 31st, 2016. They lost $1.5 million. Their net assets were reduced by $1.5 million, and they're down now to only $715,000 in net assets. So this is a you know, their reports are interesting, but they're not. I wouldn't say there's a lot of analysis in them, but they give you access to the 1023 and different things that are useful to get. But Charity Navigator, my particular beef with this Charity Navigator, and I'm glad to learn that you're critical of it, is that this organization is single-handedly, I would argue, enabling the Clinton Foundation fraud by continuing to give it a 4-star rating. When you look at the Clinton Foundation arguments, and you pull up the Clinton Foundation, you'll see 4-star rated by Charity Navigator. And what happened, they were originally, I think, on watch, and then we'll get into some of the negative stories, but I believe the Clinton Foundation may have reached out to the Charity Navigator people and maybe flown them to Africa to go on one of these safaris with Bill and see the good works and all this kind of stuff.
Starbucks gift cards.
Exactly. Here, this is right now. This is useful to have while we're on air. The Clinton Foundation is still soliciting, and you'll see why I say it in a second, on the basis of false and materially misleading documents in the public domain. On the air right now, we just were asked to donate money. But they say in here, I don't know if it's on this portion, it's somewhere on their site, they say 4-star rated, they brag about it. And they cannot have done the work, forget that I've done, just that you need to do to establish whether this is or is not a fraud.
Well, what you're pointing out is extremely important, and there are two people that I know of who would agree, and a lot of people would agree with you, but two people I've spoken with, Harold Jacob, or is it Jacob Harold? I forget, it's Jacob Harold, at GuideStar, and Dan Pilata. Both people who are in the nonprofit world would tell you that, well, Dan Pilata would basically say that Charity Navigator does its work on the cheap.
Right.
Go ahead, I'll get to that in a second. Go ahead. Okay. Yeah, there they go. Well, see, the article I was referring to earlier with regard to Charity Navigator was not the first that I've written about Charity Navigator. And I remember saying at one point that charities should never do this. They should not say, we got a great grade on Charity Navigator. It just perpetuates a myth. Now, let's get back for a second. Two things. One is, I look at GuideStar as a little different because they don't, you're right, what they do is they provide just the facts, ma'am. They give you the 990s, and as you say, the 1023s, which for our audience is the application for becoming tax exempt by the IRS. So I don't look at them as being in the same kind of playground that Charity Navigator and Charity Watch are. Or the Better Business Bureau even, although I have a higher regard for the Better Business Bureau. I think they're trying to do a good job because they go outside the 990. But the reason, I can only speculate at this because this is what happened with other charities. The reason they were, by the way, on the watch list at Charity Navigator was because they were in the news in a negative way. Charity Navigator does that automatically. But they will not go any deeper than the 990. They will not do that. So it goes back to the very first comment you made here, Charles, a while back now, and that is that should we look at the 990 as being authoritative? And I think the answer is, as we discussed, yes, but there's so much more. And so to determine that this organization is a great organization, none of those organizations would be able to say that. And that gets us into a more existential question when it comes to understanding charities. What is it that we want a charity to do? What should we know about a charity? How should we get that? What kind of information do we want? For example, let's say that I'm a homeless shelter and I'm feeding 100 men a night, 100 men and women, mostly men. And I have a goal to improve to 200 men a night, or 200 men and women a night. So the next year comes along and I can show my board that we served, and the public, 200 people a night. Well, that's a great metric. That's a fabulous thing to be able to tell. But what if, while you were doing that, you served everybody half as much food? Well, then there's context for the 200. And then the 200 isn't so pure. So there's stuff about an activity at a charity that we need to know more about. The kind of thing you've done for the Clinton Foundation. Unfortunately, that's the kind of thing that every charity needs to have done for the public to know about what its work is all about. And we can't do that. That's just impossible. So I'm proposing in the book a new system entirely that's got nothing to do with, very little to do with the 990, and more to do with the kind of work you're doing, only an ability. It's not quite the same as what you're doing. You're really going deep, deep, deep. That's wonderful. For the Clinton Foundation, you are doing a public service to the public. That can't be done for all million charities. And of course, all million charities are not as politically involved as the Clinton Foundation is. The key thing is, how do we convey relevant, comprehensive, important information to the public about a charity's activity? We go back to your question. This is public money. We have an obligation to do this. Someone has an obligation to do this, and I feel that Charity Navigator would have been in a good position, but has blown it. Now, let me just tell you a little bit about what I meant about starting it. I don't mean to give you the impression that I gave all the money to start it. I had at the time, in 2000, sold a company on investing. It was called Swerdlin White. We sold, Eric Swerdlin and I, and there was another fellow by the name of Huber, so I think it's Swerdlin White Huber. But it went by Swerdlin White. It was sold to the Bank of New York. And a client of the Bank of New York was Pat Dugan, who had sold his company for about $1 billion at the time. And he wanted to become very charitable. You know, he was one of these hardscrabble guys who worked his way up through the world, not a lot of education, not a lot of polish, but, you know, a good guy, hardworking. And he said, I want to know about charities, because if I give to a charity, I want to know it's going to a good place. And I said, well, I couldn't agree with you more. So he said, well, I want to create, it wasn't Charity Navigator at the time, it was just an idea. And I had a website of my own that failed. I have to be frank about this. It was a .com. It went down the tubes for two reasons, for three. One is that there was a tech bubble that burst. Another was that the information we were looking for from charities wasn't really all that available. Still isn't, but I mean, there was not the same sense at charities to be able to share a lot of things. And three, I have to be frank, I just probably wasn't doing a very good job. I was working 24/7, but somehow I was missing it. But the Bank of New York knew about me and connected me and Pat Dugan. And Pat went into this, and I said, this is a great idea. And he looked at my site and he thought, you know, I said, that was the problem. Everybody went, I said, oh, look, I'll be glad to do what you're asking, but I can tell you that the only resource we have is a 990. He said, that's all the resource we need. And I said, Pat, I don't think that's true. What we need is something far more comprehensive. And I knew this for years. The 990 is not going to be our holy grail. I don't care. It's the only thing we can have, and so we're going to use it and make it work. And he was right about it was the only thing we have part. I said, well, look, the reason that it's not the greatest, he wanted to compare it to something by the name of Morningstar, which is,
sure,
you probably know it in a heartbeat. I said, that'd be great, but you know, there's a lot of differences between this. First of all, the 990 comes out about a year to 2 years later after a fiscal year is over, right? Morningstar is like overnight or that week or a few days, whatever. Morningstar knows what its metrics are going to be. They're fairly defined. And so if you're looking at a mutual fund and you know where it's supposed to be investing, not only do you know if they're doing well, you know if they're being disciplined within the work they're trying to accomplish. Right. So it's not just a matter, oh, we went up 10 percentage points this past year, but did you do it within the metrics you have within yourself? The 990 doesn't have any of that kind of thing. So it comes out late, and it comes out subjectively, much more subjectively than Morningstar. So a lot of the stuff that you put in one category could go into another, and so charities can fool around with this. But third, and this is, I said, was the most important thing, Pat, people don't make their decisions charitably based on the organization's numbers. I mean, it's nice to know if they're going down the tubes, but I went out to California, Southern California, and I was before an audience, and I was thinking I was telling a joke. And I said, how many of you here would marry your spouse based on his or her 1040?
Were you in Southern California or
I was
North?
in Southern California. You wouldn't believe the number of hands that went
Oh,
up.
I was born in Southern California.
I was thinking no hands would go up.
Yeah,
Thinking,
they're
of
all-
course not, so there you go. Well, of course, but the main idea I think still holds is that we fall in love with our charities because of what they're trying to accomplish, not because of their numbers. Now, so the numbers are important. At the beginning we talked about how important. I would say they have to be accurate, and I would say they would probably be about, in the equation, 5% of the importance, or maybe less. But people want to know more about their activities and their programs, their management style, their boards, and who they're
behind it.
serving, and what?
The people behind
The
it.
people, absolutely. So when reporters call me and they say, what do you recommend people do? I say, well, basically it's a buyer's beware world, which is fine. That's not a criticism, but that does mean X. And the X here is that you've got to go out and do your own resourcing. You've got to do your own research and investigation.
To make sure they're
make sure.
operating validly.
Yes. Now, one of the problems is that people have different ideas about what valid means. Now, when Pat and I knew that I would never be the executive director of this organization, I went in there holding my nose, knowing it would be kind of fun. The math is easy. The math is easy. And
arithmetic.
a lot of the math is there now. It's the same math. They've done some tweaking and stuff, but it's basically the same. And within the world that they've chosen to be in, the math that they've done is good. But I remember talking to the first director that Pat had hired. His name was Trent Stamp, and he and I were overlapping. I was a consultant there for a year. And it was Trent who came up with the name. I think he and Pat, but I think it was Trent, came up with the idea of Charity Navigator being the name. Brilliant marketing move. And Trent, by the way, is a brilliant guy in a lot of ways. He put Charity Navigator on the map. But what he did in the process of doing that, and because of laziness that I attribute to the news media, he was able to convince everybody that what they do at Charity Navigator basically shows the worthiness of a charity. It's like totally different. If you have $1 million on your 1040, how worthy I am, how worthy can I be for you if you want to marry me? That's an entirely different question. Now, it might be important to you if I'm wealthy or not as a potential spouse. That's not out of the question, but there are other factors you take into account when you get married to someone.
Right.
Well, that's the way it is with charities. And so Trent was able to conflate the two.
I'm
for the
sorry
public.
to interrupt, but there's a comment that's caught my attention here. W. Roberts is saying shades of Billy Saul Estes, who was very involved with Lyndon Johnson, and possibly the scandal surrounding him may have been one of the motivating factors in the assassination of JFK. What does Billy Saul Estes have to do with the conversation we're having now?
That was, well, you're throwing this out cold, so let me just kind of guess at this. Billy Saul Estes ran a company that looked at something to do with farms and grain or some farm product. And the inspectors would come by and look at the top and see that whatever they were looking for was there. And then they went on
No, I see.
without looking at what was underneath.
Yeah, that's a good comparison. then.
99. Yeah, I think that's what the person is getting at there.
Well, it's also a good comparison because, of course, LBJ, government, corruption, maybe Hillary was cutting her teeth at that time, learning what was a good way to do this stuff.
Well, what you can say here is that, I don't know much about, Wikipedia. I do look at it first
Sure.
sometimes, and then I check everything. But
Yeah.
I can say from having looked at many Wikipedia entries, you really don't want to find that the second subject is fraud schemes in,
Right.
in a Wikipedia entry about yourself. That's probably what I want to do, because I'm mindful of the time.
I'm sorry, I've
That's right.
gone on and on.
No. Is I think we should jump into the slide that has the Wounded Warrior financials on it, and I just want to introduce it, if I may. It's that one, yeah. If we could make it a little bit smaller so I
Sorry.
can see it. Okay, here I want to point out, and it's not meant as a criticism of Wounded Warrior, but
Sure.
my checking, where I start, because I was trained a certain way, I'm so persnickety that the first place I start is, what's the name of the charity? Is that the real legal name that they're using, or are they doing it the Clinton way, where they they create multiple similar sounding names in different jurisdictions that are not their real legal names. So I'm satisfied I know the real name of the Wounded Warrior Project. We won't get into that. Then I look, as far as audits are concerned, maybe you have the same experience. I'm not an accountant, but I've bought and sold many companies, and you always have to have audits. So you can look at an audit as a non-CPA, and you can say, this is a crap audit. This isn't even an audit. So in the case of the Wounded Warrior Project, I'm not saying it's a crap audit, but for 2010, 11, and 12, it's not an audit of the consolidated financial results of Wounded Warrior Project. It's just, and that I would argue, it's the only negative thing I'm going to say, is that...
You can say whatever negative you want.
No, but in my quick looking at it, it did not appear to be a consolidated audit. What it is it's a report, which under New York and California law does not qualify as an audit, the way I read the statutes, and I'm not a lawyer either. But leave that aside for a second. All the subsequent 13 through 16 are all consolidated audits. And that's what the Clinton Foundation audit we will shortly explain to you is not even an audit, but it masquerades as a consolidated audit. So you look at this, I look at this growth trend. You said it back at 10 million, 12 million. I think that's back in 2005.
Yeah.
I pick it up in 2010 because this is the year that ends September 30th, 2010. Therefore, it includes 2009. And that's very important to compare to the Clinton Foundation. That's why I start here. And you look at this growth. Now, this is monumental growth, 73 million, up in here, but you actually get to 483 million of total income. That's cash contributions, in-kind contributions, investment income, everything. That is a meteoric increase. Now, why is this important? Not just for Wounded Warrior. It shows you what, a well-positioned charity. There aren't that many well-positioned charities in the United States of America. There are very few that would show that kind of growth in this time frame.
Yeah.
And what this tells you...
I don't think there's any other that showed that kind of growth.
All right. Well, but what this shows you is the guys who ran Wounded Warrior, haven't met them yet, but they're not the former President of the United States. They don't have the apparatus of a Bill Clinton and then the Bush family and everybody else behind them. So if these guys can do this kind of meteoric growth, I would argue that if the Clinton Foundation activities fighting HIV/AIDS and climate change, things that are very,
Grifting.
What? Grifting, and also grifting. But if they were really doing it correctly in the American audience, they were fighting HIV/AIDS internationally, fighting climate change. You could disagree with climate change or not. You would expect to see meteoric increase in revenues. And a big warning sign for charities that I have is if you don't see revenue growth for a good idea, or if you see less revenue for a good idea, there is a very high likelihood that people are stealing money before it gets into the books of the Clinton Foundation. And that's, when I say you start with a 990, you start with an audit, actually you need to take a step back and say, all right, conceptually, should this charity be doing well? Is it, if the people were honest in the back and the systems were there, should it be doing super well? Should it be doing not so well?
But aren't they? Isn't the Clinton Foundation making tons of dough?
No. We'll get into that a little bit. And we're only going to do top line stuff in this presentation. We're already almost 2 hours into it, and it's good that we're doing this, but it's going to take several presentations to make, if you have the patience, to go and draw the important contrast between the Wounded Warrior and the Clinton Foundation. You look at this, they raised $2 billion in revenues. And importantly, they didn't do this, and I spoke to Al about this a little. They didn't want to take government grants. They wanted to get it from the general public. So this is really something. The Clinton Foundation primarily gets it from government grants, and then, wouldn't you know, this is a softball for you. From 1998 to 2007, though the Clinton Foundation has claimed massive contributions in various press releases and then in the agreement with Barack Obama, from multiple governments, 20 governments. What would you guess is the sum total in the line on the 990 that happens every year, from 1998 to 2007? How much did they declare in government grants?
Can we make it like The Price is Right and I'll bid $1?
Right.
Government grants, probably zero.
Zero. But they received hundreds of millions of dollars of government
Since.
grants. No, in that
you win
period.
the car.
Okay.
In that period,
Okay.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So Wounded Warrior, to get this from the retail audience, when I see a charity advertising on television, I really don't like that. But I guess I didn't understand that I think they got a lot of in-kind contributions of media.
Well, they did, but they also have the $19 a month program that they did for their television,
Right.
which is the media part. They were really a hard scrabble. They are a hard scrabble organization. They are, in the truest sense of the word, a public charity,
Right.
and the public has supported them. And who wouldn't? I mean, the cause is so great. Now, part of the problem was there are a lot of causes that are great that are fraud. The charities are fraudulent. These guys are not fraudulent. Well, look how much they went down. The 2016 number is half of that year is Al and Steve not there. And what I have learned from confidential sources and have it in writing, because it's a board manual, that the first 2 quarters of the 2016 fiscal year, which is when Steve and Al were there before they were fired, contributions stayed steady. It wasn't the story from the CBS News and New York Times that made this a problem. It was the firing. The second half of that year, they lost $80 million, or about $70 million total, actually.
80.
And so that, and we just saw this, 2017 came out probably after you did this, because it was just a few days ago. They lost another $90 million.
Yeah, I haven't been able to see the 2017 audit. That's why I didn't. This is just audits.
Yeah.
And so here you see in green, remember green are good numbers and red are bad numbers, you see the amount of money spent on programs. Now, in what the Wounded Warrior people, I think, have been very clever doing is both sourcing in-kind contributions and then applying those towards the programs. Now, the Clintons, in theory, have done something like that, only they did it very different. What they did is they sourced the cash, and then they supposedly would go out and, with that cash, buy HIV/AIDS drugs and
Gotcha.
supposedly distribute it. But they bought those drugs at prices which gave profits to these generic HIV/AIDS drug manufacturers in a volume of purchases that they never would have been able to achieve had they hadn't had this series of deals with the Clinton Foundation, and they never explained any of that properly. So the accounting here, you cannot book in-kind revenues and in-kind expenses on a 990, but you have to do it on the accounting and the audits, the generally accepted accounting audits. And so therein, I think, lay some of the controversy that Steve and Al and others had with the board and with the press and all that. There's it's a little arcane.
Well, there is a lot of story in there, but to the degree you're saying it, that is correct.
Right.
But there is a line for in-kind gifts. It's deeper into the 990, but it is there. And they get a lot of in-kind gifts. There's no question about it. But the point is that they went downhill for that last 6 months, and then they went downhill for the year following.
And so when you look at this is a first surface level cut at it. We'll go back and do it in more detail in other shows. But when you look at the overhead and the fundraising expenses, they're relatively light. When you start getting out in 2016, fundraise in 2015, these expenses jump, I think, because you're into the business of retail fundraising. But they're still, you did some work, I think, that shows that for the type of fundraising they're doing, where they're spreading far and wide to the retail audience, these are in line.
Oh, they're totally in line.
Yeah.
The criticism, and we'll do this at another time too, but the criticism from Charity Navigator was totally unfounded. But and CBS bought it hook, line, and sinker. So did the New York Times. And so when you look at that, the question of out of line comes up. What do we mean by that? We mean by that something that's fictitious to begin with. There's no standard. There's no government edict as to what that number should be or what that percentage should be. Dan Pallotta has done a lot of work explaining this. And to a large degree, I agree with his perspective, and that is, for a charity to grow, it has to grow. It can't just raise a lot of money by not spending anything.
Right.
And so Wounded Warrior, Steve was very clear about this. And he said blatantly, I don't care. And I think if I'm getting this right, he said, I don't want a good rating from Charity Navigator. And he is quoted as saying, in my book anyway, to me, we made a conscientious decision not to spend money on programming for this coming year, this is a few years ago, and spend it on fundraising so that we would have it for programming in a larger way going into the future. They would keep things going. They weren't stopping their programming at all, but they made a conscientious decision to bolster their fundraising because they knew that by doing that, they'd have the money for the programs they needed. That's taking the long view. And that's a controversial thing to say at a charity because everybody's taking the short view. Well, you can't spend more than X or Y. And there is a place, there is an understanding, but it's got to be in context. And the one thing the charity, well, one of the several things the Charity Navigator doesn't have is context, total context.
Right. So the source of this information for me was we've talked about 990s, but New York State and California each have very good portals as well. And I've put links to them. We don't have to pull them up, Jason. But people have seen them before.
But they're some of my favorite links, Charles.
All right, if you want to pull them up, it's up to you.
I want people to be able to research this information on their own because I don't know if Doug knows this, but I am experiencing a federal lawsuit right now, I believe, because I've exposed a charity fraud. The fraudster is suing me.
Well, this ought to be fun.
Yeah.
Let's have fun doing that.
Fun is not the word that I would choose.
Well, I do want to get back to that, but before I forget, I want you to know that there's something on this site that's extremely important.
What is that?
And it's called Pennies for Charity. And I'm trying to find out
It's right there.
where it is. Oh, yeah, there it is. It's an annual report, where they show the number of dollars going to outside solicitors. And it's amazing the number of charities that don't make any money at all using outside solicitors. And it's amazing the number of charities that actually lose money. And it's amazing how little those who do make money make. So they do this thing every year, and it's a little wonky. It comes from a government agency and from attorneys at that government agency, so you got to take that into account. But it really is a fascinating report. And you can see. Now, it's important to know that a lot of charities don't have built-in audiences like a university might. So you have to spend money to go out there and get it. After a while, you would expect that to level off or get into the positive. But in a lot of charities, that doesn't happen. About 5 years ago now, there was an article in the Tampa Bay Times called The Worst Charities in the United States. And it was a fun read. I was part of the research on it. The reporter and I talked about this a lot. Her name was Chris Huntley, and there was someone from California. And it was just so fun. It was horrible, but I mean, it was fun in the my world because these people were doing so badly. And nobody was picking them up. A lot of them were cancer. And this goes back to the
Texas cancer.
Yeah, well,
Tennessee and Texas.
Yes, the idea behind the heartstrings is not the only thing. People need to work with their heads as well as their hearts. This is something I tell donors all the time. And you could have a dog or a cancer charity or something that would really, a kid charity, oh my God. But you got to make sure the charity's up and up, and a lot of these were not.
Right. So if we go back into the slides, Jason, for a second. I'm now going to tell you something. We've talked about it, but I'm going to show you the context that I think the Wounded Warrior people and the New York Times, if Mr. Phillips is watching this, CBS, they really need to understand how diabolical this attack was and the motivation for the attack. Because what was really going on, in my view, is that the exposure, and I'm not tooting my own horn, the exposure, or I suppose I am tooting my own horn a little bit, but of the Clinton Foundation began in earnest in March of 2015. And in the next slide, we'll show you just some of the things that are, just to me, some are not so objective and some are objective. When you bring in an independent CEO, and Eric Braverman, to the Clinton Foundation, and he signs, they produce their audit for 2013 after the final filing deadline of, I'll make sure I get this right. Yeah, the audit for 2013 was due by November 15th, the latest. The
Right, with the extension?
Yeah, that's the absolute final deadline. And under New York law, you're not supposed to file past the final filing deadline. So somehow they get an extension to get the audit done. And Eric is the first independent CEO, truly independent, not connected politically to the Clintons or otherwise. They get this audit done, from memory, December timeframe, okay? And then suddenly, Eric Braverman resigns 9 January 2015 after this audit with never a clear and convincing explanation of why did this guy from the outside come in, they paid him a lot, they extended his contract, and then he abruptly resigns, okay? That is a major league red flag. There's something, we brought it up in the past on the show, considerations in fraud and financial statement reporting. One of the big headliners is if you have sudden unexplained changes in senior management.
But Charles, what about the fact that he resigns, disappears, and when I try to talk to him, multiple people try to destroy me, get me into trouble, prevent me from seeing the guy at Oxford, security physically restraining me. That's someone with the last name Chavez calling Oxford to tell them that I'm trying to harm Eric
Well, okay,
Braverman?
remember we're talking about
Yeah,
it's another further thing, but we're now in 2015. Just to keep
right, but this is to do with Braverman. There's a lot
Right.
of attention being put on don't talk to Braverman.
Right, right. And so, and what I did through context is we reached out to him.
To Braverman.
Yeah. And the message came back, look, when I have to talk, I will. But I'm not doing anything now. In other words, I think what he was more or less saying is I'm not going to get in the way of the Hillary Clinton presidential contest, right? So we know that by the 9th of January 2015, there was...
Well, for him to, let me interrupt here, I'm sorry to do this, but for him to even say that means that the foundation was involved in the political activity.
Well, wait, I'll show you exactly.
I mean, correct? I mean, this should be a completely different question.
Right.
Why did you resign from a foundation?
Right.
I don't want to get involved with the...
Right.
So there's a red flag.
Oh.
Obviously, you guys know that. But the point, from my perspective, looking at it naively, I'd say, there's this and there's this. I want to talk to you about this. Don't talk to me about... Don't tell me this is why you can't talk to me.
Right.
I'll go talk to him.
Well, just to give you a few facts that you may or may not, which you may or may not be aware. So the Clinton Foundation was formed on October 23rd, 1997. I would argue partially because they had major league problems raising money. Because the first presidential expense trust that was to help defray the expenses, Charlie Tree, this person with foreign contacts, was exposed as somebody raising money from foreigners to support that trust, which you're not allowed to do. So they had to announce they're shutting that down. Bill Clinton and his people lost the case, stopping the Paul Jones lawsuit from going forward. They desperately needed money, and they needed a vehicle. And so here they create this William J. Clinton Presidential Foundation, which did not file a short period tax return for 1997, even though it was created on October 23rd, 1997, and its determination letter went back to that date. And even though there's abundant sign of activity in that period, they never filed a tax return for that period. They also, of the 3 directors, there was Skip Rutherford, who was a political crony of David Pryor, the former Arkansas senator and governor. So Skip was a junior guy to David Pryor, but he was made the president. David Pryor was the supposed independent trustee, but he was given the job of raising the he was chairman of the second presidential legal expense trust, which started in February of 1998. And the third trustee was Vernon Jordan's wife, Ann Jordan, who had been the co-chairman of the second presidential inauguration committee, which was the biggest donor to the Clinton Foundation in 1998. So you start right there, and you then go down a pathway of needing to raise money to pay off their legal bills. They were dead broke. They needed money for Hillary's campaign, Senate campaign. By 99 or thereabouts, Terry McAuliffe goes on the board. He's simultaneously guaranteed the Clinton mortgage, which they couldn't get. They don't disclose
you
any.
mean up here in New York?
They couldn't disclose any of that. They didn't disclose any of those interrelationships, and on. And I can go on and on and on. But this Clinton Foundation has at all times been a catchment vehicle to support the personal lifestyles and the political ambitions of the Clinton family and their allies. I mean, to say that they're divorced or pristine from that, I mean, it's not even remotely close. So I bring all this up to say that by March 2nd, reports surfaced in the New York Times of the Secret Server, and the existence of the private emails, rather, the emails that Hillary had been sending back and forth had gone over a private system outside the government and under the control of the Clinton family and perhaps the Clinton Foundation. By the 9th of March, that's when I started writing, and I know people don't like Breitbart, but I had good experience with them. I exposed this Teneo thing, which I don't know how close, you mentioned FTI. So FTI is in theory, consulting firm, publicly traded firm, that was in part, they purchased something called FD, or Financial Dynamics, from Declan Kelly and his partners. And Declan Kelly then, in theory, went off to just work in the government as our special envoy to Northern Ireland. But in practice, when you go into the Edgar filing system, you can get the agreement, his deferred compensation and incentive agreement, which operated all during the period when he was working in Northern Ireland, which has never been disclosed in government forms properly. And you can also get the Doug Band's own admission, admittedly through WikiLeaks, but nonetheless, an admission that because Declan Kelly was working in the government and couldn't service these clients, Doug Band did that. And he brags about all the money that he made in this time frame when he was actively working with the Clinton Foundation, actively working with the Clinton Global Initiative, disclosing none of this in any of the 990s.
Open competition for dopiest dope ever.
Right. So I don't know why you're giving me that heartache there with that picture, but anyway. So I had began studying the Clinton Foundation sometime in February. I can go back to my notes. But I wrote the first piece about Teneo. Teneo is a consulting firm. I mean, it's supposedly an investment and banking firm. Came out of nowhere. There have been lots of reports about compensation for projects that make no sense on a market basis.
Super nice office.
Very nice office. And Bill was involved in the formation of Teneo. He was actually technically receiving money from the predecessor entity. And it became just too complex to have him be part of it. And you look at it, here you've got the former President of the United States married to an aspiring President of the United States, and you got this investment bank over here where you could pay off Bill Clinton, pay off the Clinton family by just hiring the investment bank, and nobody will check whether the compensation was arm's length or not arm's length. So I flagged that on March 9th, and there are a lot of other things in this article. If you'd have a chance to read it, you'd be interested in it, because BC Partners, which is a very large private equity firm, global private equity firm. It came out of Baring. It used to be called Baring Capital, Baring Brothers.
Oh yes, yes.
And its investors are the sovereign wealth funds, the snootiest and most difficult big pockets to get into. And the mission of BC Partners was to invest in control positions in established global multinational companies. They made a decision to take a minority interest in Teneo when it was just getting started. Makes no sense. It's way outside the investment charter of BC Capital. Small investment, not control, not established firm. And I just said, look, that really needs to be looked into very carefully, because it's the governments, that are investing in BC and doing that. Anyway, then this piece, I do want to just put it up here, the 16 March one. This one got a large amount of attention. And I basically, you can see in a second, it should come up, unless they're now.
This is it, right?
Yeah, but it should have many more shares.
This one's actually also super useful for me, because it's got both of them against a blue background, so they're easily extracted.
So this is actually, if we leave this up here for a second and maybe refresh it, this used to have 82,000 Facebook shares on it. You can see it has down here almost 17,000 comments, right?
Yeah, it's probably a different.
Well, no. I think they're down. They're recalibrating.
That's very strange.
I have screenshots of it at 82,000, and that's I don't know if you would agree with
Charles, somebody time phone hacked your Breitbart
that.
article.
I guess so.
Yeah, I was wondering if something like that might have happened.
Yeah, could have been time phone hacked. That's true. But anyway, it did have 82,000 Facebook shares. One rough estimate is that for every 100 people who view an article, one person will take the action of sharing it as a rough metric. So that means, if it did get 82,000, a lot of people saw this. And this lays out the case, before I knew what I obviously know now about the Clinton Foundation, why the hell wasn't the IRS jumping all over this thing?
Well, you know that the IRS doesn't have the staff that it should for this kind of thing.
Yeah, right.
But it is a large,
Right.
they should be on it.
Yep.
If you're going to talk to me about Lois Lerman.
I'm not going to about
Okay.
that, because she'd gone by then.
Oh, she was, okay.
All right.
Okay.
So the issue here, and I want to make one important distinction. There's a special subset, a large and important subset of charities that I'm focusing on that I think deserves a different level of attention, and that's U.S. charities that operate internationally.
Yes.
Because U.S. charities that operate internationally are subject to special rules. They must tightly control their international operations from a U.S. base. They cannot be acting as an agent for governments. And there's a whole bunch of things, and they're very tough to regulate. If you're sitting there in the Cincinnati office, the Ogden office, the IRS, how in the hell do you understand a charity like the Clinton Foundation that's spread into 60 countries or 80 countries where the currencies are moving like this and the opportunities are rife to just skim money out of such a charity? So I put this, we don't have to put the link up, I put my first detailed analysis of the Clinton Foundation up on the 20th of April. Then on the 5th of May, and I know I bring this up because Bill O'Reilly, I know, was deeply involved with the Wounded Warrior
He
Project.
was a big supporter.
And I think he still is.
I think he is too. I mean, we had a bigger voice then.
But he called on the FBI, called for the FBI to investigate the Clinton Foundation on the 5th of May, and there's a link, you don't have to put the link up, the 5th of May, 2015, right? So the heat is now really on the Clinton Foundation when he does that. And then the FBI opened an investigation. I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's a link, and maybe we will pull this up, if you don't mind, Jason, this link. The FBI opened an investigation, full-scale, uppercase investigation, into mishandling of classified information by Hillary Clinton and Uma Abedin and others on the 10th of July, 2015. Not 16, 15. So well before, they were looking at Wounded Warrior. And here you have, if we hit this first one, there's 20 dumps here. This is, I don't know if you've been on the FBI vault, very useful.
You told me about this when we talked, and I'm interested in knowing more because any FBI investigation into a charity would be very interesting to me, especially this one. So.
Well, this is a recent. There was an FBI investigation into the Clinton Foundation between 2001 and 2005 that was headed by, when Bob Mueller was head of the FBI, James Comey led the investigation, Rod Rosenstein was in charge of the tax division of the IRS, and they didn't see obvious fraud.
Well, this is just the most recent FBI.
Yeah, this is the most. But this takes you through in great depth. This is out there. This was going to be classified like 2040 or something, but they made a decision at the FBI to let it out. And it's 35 pages, so we won't go through it now, this particular dump, but it takes you through that there was indeed a real investigation specifically into whether Hillary Clinton herself had mishandled classified information.
Just a small suggestion moving forward. Perhaps instead of addressing her as Miss Clinton, we could call her mishandling classified information.
All right, Will.
You guys.
All right. So if we go back into the actual slide. So then here we have this. This is a Bloomberg link. This one here, yeah. So this may take a second to get in through your screen or whatever, but this is a story about Bill and Hillary collecting mammoth amounts of money through speeches, but most importantly, Bill Clinton was honorary chancellor of the of Laureate University, Laureate Education, which is a for-profit, publicly traded now university system. He was paid $17.6 million for part-time work between 2010, April-May 2010, April-May 2015. They have never disclosed those payments in the Clinton Foundation 990s, even though he was an officer of various Clinton Foundation, director or officer of various Clinton Foundation things. And the Clinton Global Initiative as we'll explain in a second, was never set up as a charity lawfully. The the joint venture between the Clinton Global Initiative and Laureate to create Clinton Global Initiative University was never authorized by the state of New York or any other state to be a university. And it's tiny. The whole thing, the whole Clinton Global Initiative was a minuscule thing, and the university joint venture even smaller. And here's Bill taking $17.6 million for part-time work and not disclosing any of that in any of these filings? Still?
Interesting.
You know?
I didn't know that, any of this.
Yeah, so,
Look into it.
so then if we go back into the thing, by the 16th of November, and this is important to your context, I think, for why they went after Wounded Warrior. You said they started sniffing into it a month or so.
I think it was actually well before that. So
All
that late summer of 2015, I believe.
All right, but so here,
Yeah.
you know, it fits in nicely. Then on the 16th of November, I was pounding the table because I had exposed GE and had access to multiple reporters and stuff. I was able to get on, not the main, actually in 15, not so much the mainstream, but 2016, I was actually on CBS and NBC, radio and whatever. But here after I'm pounding the table saying you gotta refile all your tax returns to the very beginning, they say, nah, we're not going to do that. We'll just do 2010, 11, 12, and 13. And I warned on radio and television and in print, I said, look, if you do a half-assed job of this and you file incorrectly, you're only going to further complicate your problems because you're going to have to refile again and then again. And here, we haven't even begun talking about state tax returns, which you also have to file. Those are all wrong too. So with that context, if we go to back into the slides, go to the next page, we put up Wounded Warrior Project, right? And we had a bunch of numbers. These are the declared program expenses of the Clinton Foundation, right? Right there, the various initiatives. And then the percentage of the total, okay? And now I'm going to take you through each of the initiatives, okay? The first one, the Clinton Health Access Initiative, was illegally organized on September 29th, 2009, okay? What they did is they had begun fighting HIV/AIDS internationally by their admission in 2002 without having the authority to do any international activities. On their 990, on their 1023 for the Clinton Foundation, they were asked, are you going to be international? No. Okay. Really? This was supposed to be the Clinton...
It was on the 1023.
On the 1023.
Okay.
It's up there on their site. 1023 lists out, they're going to be a library and a museum, and in the 1023 elaborates the activities will be carried out in Little Rock in a presidential park, period. No New York office, no Boston office, and certainly no international activities. And then in the 1023 for this Clinton Health Access Initiative, they're asked, are you a successor corporation, successor activity? And they say no, even though there are multiple press releases in the time frame from organization through the date that, yes, Lois Lerner granted federal tax exemption on March 15th, 2010. There are multiple press releases talking about, and multiple academic reports, multiple, you name it, saying that that was certainly a predecessor organization. And more to the point, it was the largest piece of the Clinton Foundation in 2007, 8, and 9, which we know from the real versions of their, in quote, audits that are not on the Clinton Foundation website, but that are in the New York State website, right? So it's a knowing, massive falsehood that it was not a successor. The Clinton Global Initiative, we talked about some of those private gains, right? And for our viewers, you know this well, and Jason now knows this extremely well. Private gain does not mean money alone. It means an advantage, a competitive edge, but it certainly means $17.6 million in compensation for part-time work as chancellor of a for-profit university. I mean, that's a lot more money than I think most university presidents around the world make for full-time work.
Chancellor a weird title? Like he's like the,
right?
You know, the grand poobah of laureate, or what?
Well, laureate is a whole nother story. And the whole idea of for-profit education, I think for-profit education can make sense in certain areas, but in social and liberal arts, no way. No way does that make any sense in my view. But anyway, the Clinton Global Initiative began operation in 2005. It held multiple conferences here in New York, all sorts of publicity for it. What was it? It was a closed session to brag about what you might in theory do in the future, you would make commitments to action which are not pledges. There's never been an accounting for all of this. There's never been any consideration of the massive private gains that investment funds derive by saying, we're going to donate this, and corporations derive. None of that has ever been properly organized. And none of these, so these two entities here never did their state filings, never did international filings properly, and the Clinton Foundation itself never explained properly all their doing business as names that they needed to do in every state of the union. They never did any of that properly. Then we get to the Presidential Center. There's the most important agreement that I know of that is not on the Clinton Foundation website or in any of these 990s is an agreement that we found dated November 18th, 2004, where with the National Archives, with the City of Little Rock, and with the Clinton Foundation, where the Clinton Foundation covenanted that they would forever remain a 501c3 publicly supported charity with a 509A1 substatus. They covenanted to do that. The agreement itself, the reason it's not on the Clinton Foundation website, we put it up on this website, is that it is littered with fraudulent statements. We are a validly baloney. On March 24th, 2004, Clinton Foundation HIV/AIDS initiative was created in an attempt to house these international activities in a structure that could gain federal tax exemption. There's no evidence that thing ever got federal tax exemption. There's abundant evidence of its activities around the world. Just that one thing alone was outside the purview of their authorized tax exempt purposes. And so there's no way they should have signed that agreement on the 18th. And furthermore, that a publicly supported charity cannot be controlled by a family. You can't say you could be a private foundation controlled by a family,
exactly.
But you can't be Wounded Warrior Project couldn't say that Al Giordano and his wife, and if he has a daughter, are going to control it for the rest of eternity. But on November 2nd, 2013, the Clinton family had the bylaws changed to create a two-class structure, the A and B directors, where the Class A directors control the charity at every board meeting, and in between the board, this is the more noxious one, in between the board meetings, they have the right to control the charity with their actions not subject to review. So, it's just, you can't do that.
As I mentioned to you on the phone, I'd never heard of a Class A and Class B directorship at a nonprofit.
Right. So the other thing they did is we've done some, I won't bore you now, our listeners know about this, but we've done a lot of work, and I've written articles showing that the Clinton Foundation, $28.5 million went missing out of the books in 2004. They committed, I think, bank and wire fraud. They overstated the value of their donation. We're going to do another piece about $36 million. We're going to demonstrate it. Money stolen in 2004. All told, $64 million appears to have gone missing in 2004. No audits. Clinton Climate Initiative, never organized as a legal entity. They began work in 2005-06 internationally, promising this, promising that, no accounting for it. Multiple press releases around the world of all their activities. No authority for the Clinton Foundation to control this thing, do all that. This Clinton Juster Canadian partnership, and I had to fit it in, illegally organized in Canada, illegally controlled from New York by an agency agreement that is not publicly disclosed but mentioned on the website out in Canada. There are all kinds of technical violations in Canada. The Canadian bank accounts of this entity are not disclosed in the 990 for the parent company, the Clinton Foundation, and they need to be. The Clinton Development Initiative is a fiction. There's no legal entity, never formed. The Clinton Health Matters Initiative is another fiction. The other programs, none could have been organized lawfully. So, one time I got into this big fight with somebody, I'm not going to say who it is.
Not
but
the guy on the street outside.
No. This is a pretty famous guy, and we got a difference of opinion about investing. And this guy says to me, Charles, I'd like to know what your investment philosophy is. And I said, very simple. My investment philosophy is quite simple. I like to invest in things that actually exist legally. That's where I start. And similarly, I like to donate to charities that actually exist lawfully. This is, in my opinion, not as a lawyer, a formless aggregation it's a criminal enterprise, because none of these things have been formed or monitored or controlled properly, yet they have sourced $2.3 billion from 1997 to the present. So, and I could demonstrate, we have these amended bylaws. They have been only reluctantly and perhaps haphazardly surfaced into the various states. This is a material adverse development that should have been immediately notified to all the states. On top of this, we've talked about it in the past, these people have been disciplined by the state of Mississippi 3 times. They haven't disclosed that to all the states yet. They used an illegal fundraiser that is subject to a consent agreement in Pennsylvania. They haven't disclosed that. That's O'Brien, McConnell, and Pearson, very well-known fundraising firm. And there's just multiple defects in all these filings.
Wow. Well, this is news to me, all of this. And what you're saying, if it's all true, and I'm assuming that it is, are there people that you can talk to about this? Are there AGs in different states?
Oh well, that's this show is all about. I mean, we've been at this for a while now, Jason and I, and we have, I can say what I could say is that the AG of the state of New York, for example, Schneiderman, who is, some would argue, I've argued, he's a political hack. Many are political hacks, and Xavier Becerra, I'm sad to say, is definitely a hack. But these 2 big states, I mean, surely we can agree about one thing, that let's not rape and pillage in the name of charities.
Well, I was going to say, the Charities Bureau, I would imagine that Schneiderman would not disagree with a follow-through on a lot of the things you're describing.
He hasn't done anything.
Have you talked to Jim Sheehan, the head of the Charities Bureau?
I don't. I reported this, and I've got nothing back.
I mean, you've got. I'm just going to be skeptical, if you don't mind. You've got a lot of stuff here that everybody's ignoring, and in my world, this is stuff you don't ignore.
Well, welcome to Sunday with Charles.
That's right. Actually,
bada boom.
Yeah, but actually, what has happened, and it's been publicly disclosed, there is a U.S. attorney hard at work in Little Rock. There's another one hard at work in Salt Lake City.
Are there people, and this is important to me. I mean, clearly there's a political thread through this conversation here, and I'm kind of fighting it all the way through here. But what would be important to me is that this is not a political process, that there be people who are both Republican and Democrat, or liberal and conservative, friends of Hillary and Bill and not. Everybody would, I think, find common cause here. And what we need are people who are of your stripe and people who are of other stripes coming together.
Oh, I agree. Well, so you'll see this coming week, and there's actually going to show in a second, I've done an article about the Clinton-Bush Haiti Fund.
Yeah.
And the Clinton-Bush Katrina Fund, and there's going to be another one about the Clinton-Bush Tsunami Fund. And I have no problem. I started out, exposing GE, which I don't think you could say is, I would argue at the time it was pretty more conservative Republican than whatever. So
yeah.
I'm just against fraud.
Okay, good. Then we can shake hands on that till the cows come home. The question, though, is, and as I'm hearing you, there's just so much that you're alleging, and I see that there's a lot of websites and so forth and resourcing on it, but there's so much here that to ignore this. What about the Chronicle of Philanthropy might not be that detailed. There's got to be some other place.
Well, let's put it this way. What I've offered to do, what I always offer to do, I did the same thing on GE. I will walk into the state of New York Attorney General Charities Bureau. I'll walk into Democratic Party, not so much, but I'll walk into Columbia. I'll walk into NYU. I'll walk into anybody who has serious credentials looking at this, and I will subject myself to any of the questions that people want to ask me, provided we have this kind of resource. We have the internet, we have the ability to go on, look at it, and I'll show chapter and verse. So I think the answer to your question is that the regulatory apparatus saw benefit in letting this keep going because it implicates the Bush wing, it implicates the Obamas, it implicates the Clintons. It puts the regulatory apparatus above the president.
And when you, but see, the thing is, when you say that, it really implies corruption at the regulatory apparatus level.
Yep.
Is that,
Pretty
is that like
much.
an obvious?
Funny
naive
you
thing
should
to say?
mention that.
It's funny.
About that.
Well, but I'm not quick to be cynical, okay?
Right.
I'm really not. And I love what you're saying, and it's really fun, and both of you are kind of fun. But I also have to be skeptical.
Please
I want you
do.
to know that, because just my life. And, but I can be skeptical and respectful as well. And what I'm hearing here is a lot of, I mean, you probably could go on for many, many, many more hours on the wrongs of the Clinton Foundation. And my question is, first of all, this needs to be shown in a way that people can understand it, the regulatory agencies can understand it, and what further needs to be shown is their lack of activity, their lack of action in response to those allegations. You know, you're Charles Ortel, but you're also a member of the public, which puts you in kind of an important category also. And as a member of the public, you have the right to know what's going on at the charity. You know, all the things you went through the programming initiatives at the the Clinton Foundation, and every one of them you said was illegal or wrongfully
Yeah.
put together. Every one of them.
Right.
And there's millions and millions of dollars in that
Right.
whole thing there.
Billions.
Well, when you add it all up, yes, exactly. So the and that isn't, and you're not even getting into the pay for play, you know, the source of
Right,
all of this
right,
stuff.
right.
So when you take a look at the whole thing, that's a huge story, and it's quite frankly in my world book worthy. So,
Right.
but
Right.
I think that story needs to be told. It needs to be told in I mean, it needs to be investigated. What you're saying, and you've done the investigating, so I don't mean to be.
No, it's fine. Others need to look at it. Yeah.
So that it resonates. But what's happening here? And I don't know about who's the donor source for all of this. Who are the donors? But a lot of this stuff could be paid for by our public treasury.
Well,
And we
absolutely.
don't want that.
Well, so, you know, you started out talking about Exeter, and that's a great school. My youngest brother went there as well, and it's one of the top schools in the world. And it's easy to get excited about a school that's been around for 200 plus years, doing good things and maintaining a high level of consistency, and that's one great world to operate in.
Yeah.
What I think we're talking about here is a very different world, and that's a world where a charity with no controls, spread around the world, connected to somebody who might have been president of the United States, who has then a daughter who could maybe be president of the United States, who, you know, you can say what you want about the past, but there's certainly questions about around the Clintons, right? If you establish that such a in quotes foundation is a place that you can route tax deductible money, and even better, if it's so crooked that you get a crook who needs to reduce their taxes, and they come to this crooked foundation, and I'm not saying I can prove this, but comes to the Crooked Foundation and say, you know, you got a tax problem this year. Let us give you a slip of paper that said you gave us $10 million, and nobody's going to check because we've got the IRS gamed and we've got the Justice Department gamed, whatever. This becomes, you know, I'm actually writing something myself about this. People suspect the for-profit world, you know, because the profit motive, it's evil and all that in theory. But in truth, you can scam a lot more money out of a not-for-profit than you can out of a big publicly traded for-profit, because the big publicly traded for-profit has competitors, it has investors, it has a lot of people who are going to look at the books and dive deeply into them. But if you've got something like this, where by my estimate, it's not $2 billion that went towards this thing. It's maybe $100 billion or more, but only
Yeah.
$2 billion hit the books.
Well, I would agree with you that, I disagree with you. I don't think a lot of people would say the for-profit motive is a bad thing. What I say is bad is fraudulently getting profits is a bad thing.
Well, I agree with you.
You would agree with that too. So I think the idea of our commerce in the United States is a positive one, and we need more of that. I mean, this is really, I think capitalism is a good thing, but non-fraudulent capitalism, which is a tough thing to ferret out.
That's the rub, yeah.
That's the rub. But so we could all agree on that: conservative, Republican, Democrats, liberals. But you're right, I think, about the back door, the open back door at the nonprofit world. That's why we really do need more regulation. And very few people in the United States in the nonprofit world will acknowledge that we need more regulation. They think there's already too much regulation, and they use that time-honored phrase, self-regulation. Now, I know that it's not a conservative talking point to have a lot of regulation. I get that. But by the same token, what you're describing right now might require regulation. Or you might say all it requires is that the current laws be obeyed and that somebody cared. And I don't know right now where that is because I don't know what all of the details that you're describing.
It's kind of the whole country. If they would observe the laws we have right now, we'd be all right.
Yeah, I think we'd be better off than we are right now. I mean, we might disagree on what needs to be regulated more and less, but in terms of nonprofits, there is essentially zero regulation.
Right.
I mean, nobody's regulating what you're describing. And on top of that, the idea behind an IRS audit is that we have to find out if they're not pursuing the objectives written out in the 509A or their letter. And they're not going to do that. They're going to say, fine with this. Everything that you've just described, they might say, okay, well, they didn't put in their original letter, but this is how things grow.
Well, let me just, it's unfair in a way for me to do this to you, but I'm going to be.
Go ahead, no.
It won't hurt.
That's
So,
right.
so the
Said
period,
the doctor.
period 1998 through 2004 is when they built this presidential mess, the complex out in Little Rock.
Mm-hmm.
There is no audit in the public domain that anyone has found yet for 98 and 99, and there were 3 million of revenue or more in every year, so they had to definitely do a real accounting audit. For the period that we have been able to get, 2000 through 2004, in footnote 1 to we've done this before, and you'll see it if you look. I could send it to you as well. The accounting firm says these financial statements are prepared using techniques that are not permitted in the United States of America. This is what their audit says, right?
I'm sorry, what did you say the audit?
The audit says the Board of Trustees uses accounting practices which are not allowed in the United States of America. And on that basis, we're writing this up.
Wow.
Yeah. It's that cut and dry. That's when they,
Okay.
You know, it's, and this same firm, BKD, which is a small firm, Boy King Dog, is employed by the Clinton Foundation all the way through 2012. Right? Even though they sat there and they said, we're letting the trustees in this key period not keep track of accounts receivable, accounts payable, uses the so-called modified cash basis of accounting, which is not allowed for something this big.
And the state attorney general didn't pick up on that?
In Arkansas?
Let's not go there.
No, I mean,
I'm
just saying because of the Clinton power. And it's not.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Not because they're.
No, it's just because of the Clinton power. You see, and also because there's so many important. This fraud, which I've said publicly, this fraud touches Stevens Inc., the investment bank. It touches the city of Little Rock, the mayor. I mean, not for personal endeavors, but for failing to control this. It touches the University of Arkansas. It touches Walmart. It touches the Walton Family Foundation. It touches all, the heart of Arkansas. And they're very clever. They got everybody involved in it. So to expose it implicates so many people that you're sitting there saying, well, not you, but people are sitting there saying, well.
Well, but I also feel like this kind of a problem is a problem even bigger than all of that, because it strikes to the core of why we have a nonprofit sector.
Right.
If what you are saying is true, then we really have to re-examine why we have a nonprofit sector.
In just listening to you guys talk and hash this out or whatever, it occurs to me that fraud is almost like water or electricity. It flows to the path of least resistance. And as you're talking about the lack of regulation or the unenforced regulations, it causes me to think about other unregulated areas that are being subjected to fraud, like cryptocurrency. We've heard so much about frauds that have rapidly risen around that unregulated segment. Maybe it's time for enforcement to occur. I mean, what can we do, Charles, to make that happen?
Well, so I don't have as much experience with nonprofits as you do. Very few people do, but I've been around them for my adult life, and what I have experienced among the charities that I get connected to is that people are scrupulous, not to a fault. They're just straight up scrupulous. They're careful. They like to follow the rules, you know, and they get excited about it. They don't show up and, you know, make less money than they could in the for-profit world because they hate the charity. I mean, they think it's a valuable thing, whatever it might be. So the overwhelming majority of charities, I would argue, is probably pretty
I think
careful.
you're absolutely correct.
And the point you raise is an excellent one, that good charities, people don't care about the tax deduction. I'm not saying you should forget about it, but they're giving the money away because they want the money to go for the intended purpose. That's what they're thinking about primarily. But I think it's the case that the last time that the private foundation sector was, the laws were changed was 1969. That was the last time there was and there really hasn't been an attempt to bring regulation of charities into the 21st century, into 2018 or 19. And the requirement that charities register in all these different states puts a big burden on the small ones.
Yeah, it does.
There need to be special rules about American charities operating internationally that are far better. There should be a special box that you go into if you want to do that kind of stuff.
Given your work with the Clinton Foundation, that would be the spotlight, the international world. You have to keep in mind that we have over 1 million fundraising charities, and they range from small churches to the Clinton Foundation size, okay, and everything in between, and every other kind of cause in between. And you say, okay, how can this be one sector? It's like saying business is X when it's like a million X's. So we need, I think, to understand that there's a difference among charities, but also organizations that do business or who help people in other countries need a special level of exemption or oversight or something, because there's too much room for fraud.
So I see we're coming up here on almost 3 hours.
Are you kidding?
Yeah, time's flying. We're having fun. If we go to the
my wife, she won't give me dinner when I get home.
all right, what we'll do is I'm putting this up here for the further benefit. This is for reading later, but I'll just tell you that on January 27th,
Yes.
2016.
That's the same day that.
Right.
Okay.
Somebody walked into the Washington field office of the FBI and said, "Hey,"
But just reiterate, the same day that what?
The Wounded Warrior Project
was attacked. The same day. Somebody walks into the FBI and said, "Hey, I sent a whole bunch of incriminating information into James Comey earlier in January, and they won't even acknowledge receipt."
And they said they didn't get it.
Well, it's here, right, what they said. And yeah, they said he called to confirm receipt. He could not do so. And therefore, he just shows up. This is a senior, he or she shows up in the FBI Washington field office, which you remember is where Peter Strzok is and all these questionable people, McCabe and whatever, show up there. And he says, "This is so serious." And remember, this is when Bernie Sanders had a shot.
Yeah.
This is so serious. I want to go into a SCIF, the secure,
Yes.
whatever they are.
The vault where they can't hear anything.
And I want to tell you what I know, right?
Secure communication.
Isn't it secure, compartmentalized, and whatever it is?
Information
SCIF.
facility
It's
or
a
something.
SCIF. So the guy walks in. They don't write this up until the 22nd of February, 2016. Now, you don't know this, but we'll now tell you that lots of people watch this show, including, we think, people possibly on the Inspector General staff, many attorneys generals, possibly the FBI, foreign governments are watching this. We need to go back over this time frame and ask, why did it take so long to write this up? What did this person actually put into James Comey? Who had custody and control over the information? Why did it take so long to actually study it? And what the hell was, Hillary's book, what the hell was happening here? And we need to go back over this. And this, we provide a link to where you can get it. Don't pull it up, Jason, because I'm going to try to fly through this. You go to the next page. This is really for the benefit of you on the Wounded Warriors analysis. On the 15th of July, so after Comey, in theory, exonerated Hillary, there's a report, again in this dump 6, pages 53 and 54, that show, hey, there was a lot of classified information on this server. And this is highly material to the election in the time frame, the 15th of July, 2016. To understand the true motives, I don't have any doubt that the Democratic Party was all in, and the Obama administration all in to have Hillary win. I get it, that's fine. I don't have any doubt that Trump and his people were fighting at all costs. But this is material. The fact that the FBI had an investigation started on July 10th, 2015, that had reached the point by the 15th of July that they had established, actually established in February 2016, but had reached the point that they knew how many emails contained classified information that had been circulated. This is, I mean, if I'm a Democratic voter and I'm inclined to vote for Hillary Clinton, this would, in my mind, disqualify her. You know, that she had private servers, private devices, and there was this much classified information. We keep on going to the next one. And this is out there done in this way so that people can read it at leisure. I had a sense this might run long, so I did it this way. You'll feel free to read it in landscape as opposed to. But they found in September this what's his name, Anthony Weiner and Uma Abedin's laptop with all these emails. They found it sometime in September, but they buried it in the New York office. They didn't send it into Washington. And by October 27th, I guess this is October 30th, they issue a search warrant at 1:57 p.m. in the afternoon to go through this material and study it. This is right before the election. The election was the 7th.
Charles, is it worth mentioning that Andrew McCabe was, I think, special agent in charge of the New York office for a long time?
But at this time, yes, he was, and the next door neighbor or somehow living close to Clinton in
Might have friends at the New York office?
Right, exactly, and deputy director of the FBI. So this, I bring this up to say that, you know, the Wounded Warrior Project may have served as a convenient foil to distract from the Clinton Foundation and say, you know, to put out in the public domain through the New York Times and their links to CBS, hey, charity fraud happens everywhere, so that, you know, maybe there's truth to the Wounded Warrior Project, maybe fraud, maybe there isn't. I think there is no truth to it being a fraud, but they put it out there, they muddied the waters, and that gave them a big stink bomb to use to confuse the issue of whether there was a problem at the Clinton Foundation, in my view. We get deeply into this, you're going to find that the evidence, and I think we're going to see a lot of this evidence in the Horowitz report, because the Horowitz report has already, the bit on McCabe, has already confirmed that there was a Clinton Foundation investigation that was tamped down in August of 2016.
And sorry to be selfish, but there is someone trying to bring a federal terrorism charge against me, and by going to the New York Times and CNN and telling them that a bomb hoax was called in, they created one of their bedrock foundation go-to points for, hey, Jason called in a bomb threat, when I absolutely did not.
Yeah.
Same tactic.
Yeah. So if we keep on going here, and we'll try to bring it home so you're allowed to have dinner with your wife. This is just, we don't even have to cover this, just more details of what was on the server, how much was classified, et cetera. You can read this at your leisure. If we go to the final page, and I will fly through this is where we talk about, you know, the next little bit. Let me see, I won't cover the first 2 points. This, and I won't, let's not even bring up the links, but you've done a lot of work on Imran Awan. And George Webb actually has done a lot of work on Imran Awan and others, Luke Rosiak, and I've gone into, this is this Pakistani fellow who, with various family members, was providing IT services to, I think, 43 members of Congress. And nobody's really following that chain yet. And how is it that Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Xavier Becerra, the Attorney General, and when he was in Congress, he's Attorney General in California, but he was in Congress, why would they enter into such an arrangement, giving these foreign nationals access to the House of Representatives, multiple computers? What was really going on? And there's now rumor or a story that members of this team may have given the information to the Pakistani ISI in this 2016 timeframe. So this question of foreign powers meddling in our government and meddling in is something that I think we need to explore. It's not simply Russia, it's Pakistan, it's China, it's our allies. We may be doing some of it as well, but this is going to now get, I think, a lot of focus. Judge Janine is a friend of ours and continues to give great focus on her program. Again, you don't have to pull up the link. Chelsea, I've tried to put her on notice and give her a lifeline to say, look, you're a grown-up now. You're vice chairman of this foundation. You're getting a lot of your expenses reimbursed. You're traveling around the country like a former president. When you're not, you either, if you want to try to defend this behavior, which I don't think you can, with reference to facts, then you're in our gun sights, not with a gun, but we're going to focus on you. From the other hand, you're prepared to step up and say, look, I got into this. I had no idea it was as bad a mess as it was. I tried. We're talking about my parents. They're pretty famous people. They're pretty headstrong. I couldn't stand up to them, but I'm not going to put up with it. I think she is really right in the middle of a very important decision that will define her life, because she has been so involved with this foundation. She needs to focus on the facts, stop relying on others. And again, if she comes forward and says, whoops, this was a mistake, I tried to correct it, I'll support her for that. But if she falls in bed with her parents, which I would understand she had to do, that's going to be a very bad choice. Looking ahead, and this is just political stuff, and I'll go quickly through it. Say what you want about Democrats and Republicans. I think the real issue in November 2018 is going to be incumbents. I think in both parties, the Berniacs want to see more disruption in ways than the establishment Democrats. The Trump people want to see more than the establishment Republicans. That's what the rest of the year is going to be all about. Donald Trump is going to, it's warm now. He's going to fire up Air Force One. He's going to travel around the country. He's going to do his rallies. I would not assume that those rallies are going to be ineffective. I think they're going to be quite galvanizing. And we saw what happened in the 2016 period. He knows how to do that stuff. This meeting with Francis Macron tomorrow, that is Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I think. We haven't talked explicitly about this, but we have very good ties in France. Oh. And we have, France is the largest donor to the Clinton Foundation, several hundred million, plus $100 million.
The government of France?
Well, basically as agent for the people of France. When you fly through France, a portion of your plane ticket goes into a pot and goes to the Clinton Foundation through Switzerland. And we put a gigantic file together that is with the French government authorities and has been, and we hope that that's going to bear fruit.
Coincidentally, right before Nicolas Sarkozy was arrested?
Right, exactly. And the person in France on Nicolas Sarkozy's case is a woman called Eliane Houlette, who is a special prosecutor, but a permanent special prosecutor for financial crimes. That is the person we gave the file to.
Yes.
Well introduced.
Okay.
And so we also have made a lot of progress around the world. Before our meeting today, I met with somebody who's very well stuck into another gigantic government donor who's on this case. Multiple people now, multiple governments around the world are watching this very closely. I think in the coming week, this is in the what will happen category. I think we're going to start to see the drumbeat build on the Iranian deal, both changing it and also stepping up the pressure on Iran. I think that's going to come not simply from the Trump people here in the United States, it's going to come from the Saudis, Israel, and others. There's a big game afoot in the Middle East. And I had put in, you've already put this up here, this one LifeSet thing. I did that, this one here, on the Clinton-Bush-Katrina Fund. It ran early last week, I think. There are two subsequent pieces that I was going to come out last week, but Barbara Bush died, and so we held it back, but those are coming out soon. Mm-hmm. And this is a gigantic scandal when you pull into it. It's Clinton and Bush. And I think in the case, it's not just because I'm so negative on the Clintons, but I think objectively, the Clinton role is far worse than the Bush role in this, but the Bush people deserve to be slapped hard as well, because they could have brought this thing under control. So this is a bad tale, disaster relief. What happens is in disaster situations like Wounded Warrior and HIV/AIDS and maybe climate change, there's a gigantic reservoir of goodwill and pocketbooks around the world for those things. So when you have a cause like this and you have supposedly reputable people attached to it, you're going to get a flood of money. And there should be a special oversight of these type of disaster relief charities, and special penalties actually do apply. For disaster relief charity fraud, The maximum jail sentence per count is 30 years per count. And it's $1 million, I think, per count. And that would be, as you know, that's asking for money, not necessarily collecting money. So you send an appeal of 1 million pieces of mail asking for money, and you're a fraud. See ya. So I rushed it to a close just because I knew that if I did not do that, we'd be here for breakfast with Jason on Monday.
Monday with Charles.
Monday.
Well, I think there's quite a lot to still discuss. And Doug, thank you for joining us today and sharing all of your knowledge. Was there something you wanted to say in closing?
I would love to continue the conversation.
Oh,
As you know, I've said this before, I'm hearing this, a lot of it for the first time. I know you have a history of looking at the Clinton Foundation. It's very academically sound activity, and I don't have any problem with that at all. But I don't know the amount of information you have. And so to be comfortable for me, I'm going to have to dig into this. And I would like to do that.
oh, great. I mean, we might be able to make a file available to you that is could be more than 5,000 pages.
Wow.
I would invite you to binge watch the playlist on the Crowdsource The Truth YouTube channel of all the Sunday with Charles episodes. There's quite a lot
Would that be better
there.
than the Americans, do you think?
It might be. I don't know. You'd have
Sounds
to-
like it's of the same genre.
That's right. That's right. Well, Doug, thank you very much for joining us. Your knowledge and experience are invaluable. The information, I loved seeing the shock on your
Right.
face at the realization that Charles has presented so much evidence of fraud that it is fully shocking that nothing has happened yet.
Well, I think something it may be happening. I'm seeing the sign. I mean, we have, as we mentioned, the May 15th deadline coming up. We have, replacements of U.S. attorneys. We have announcements about investigations. The January 4th, 2018 announcement that the Little Rock U.S. attorney had reopened the investigation. We have Horowitz's report coming. We have a lot of signs that things are going to happen at federal level. They need to happen at state level. And I can tell you that foreign governments are watching what the feds and what the states are going to do, and they want their money back. They rightly want their money back.
Yeah. It's a lot of money. And with that, I think we will say goodnight to everyone, and we'll be back on Wednesday as Charles continues to close in.
Well, good luck to you.
Thank
and
you.
Like I said, I'd like to learn more.
Anytime.
And,
You're welcome anytime.
To the degree this affects charity and all of what you've just described, other than the political parts of it, to the degree it affects charity, it's extremely interesting to me, and I feel is needed to be investigated, because it's going to affect the whole nonprofit structure of the United States.
Well, you're very kind, Doug. Thanks for your hard work. And thanks also to the folks at Wounded Warrior Project who are struggling now, and the ones who are unfortunately forced out. I think they got a raw deal, and we'll go back into that.
We'll get to that again, because there's a lot more to go on that, but I can tell you this much. They got a bad deal, but they will land on their feet. They are kind of already landing on their feet, because you can't keep good people down.
That is true. And with that, I want to thank everybody for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow.